the craziest execution methods from around the world. When you talk about executions, everybody seems to talk about what their last meal would be, but nobody seems to talk about what their execution method would be. And in this video, I'm going to show you some truly obscure and brutal execution methods from around the world that you would never want to experience. And as always, this video only gets more brutal as the list goes on. Italy. Falling. Italy has a long and rich history, and for that reason, I'm going to give a few examples of how they used this one torture method throughout different parts of its history in different ways. Let's start in pre-Roman Sardinia. Imagine you're just an old person living in your little hut, maybe on the coast of the island that you reside on. You realize that you're getting up there in age and realize that soon the ritual was going to happen. One day, a group of young men come into your house and tell you it's ritual time, and you prepare for what's about to happen, as you've seen it happen to other men your age. You're first given a mysterious neurotoxic drink. You are then carried to a nearby cliff by these young men. But these young men aren't just on this cliffside to watch the sunset with you. They are raising you above their head Lion King style and throwing you off a cliff. That's right. The first execution method we're talking about is falling. Definitely one of the most simple entries on this list, but trust me, the implications are pretty wild. In this first example I gave in pre-Roman Sardinia, people were literally just executing the elderly. Like, this was a common ritual. During this time, if you were an elderly person who was unable to support themselves, you were ritually killed. And this was just an accepted practice in pre-Roman Sardinia. And as I described, how this would typically go is they would get the old person intoxicated through a neurotoxic plant that was known as the sardonic herb. Regardless, once they get their elderly victim nice and high, they will take them somewhere nice and high. And at that point, they have one of two options. They are either dropped from a high height or beaten to death and then dropped from a high height. And that's just the Sardinian version of an old folks home. There's really not too much more to say about literally falling off a cliff, but it is an interesting execution method, and I wanted to add it specifically for this reason because in Italy, they were just doing it differently. This wasn't the only time that falling was used as an execution method in modern day Italy. For example, during the Roman Empire, an emperor by the name of Tiberius was known to also use this method, also for an interesting reason. Emperors would execute people for a plethora of reasons, but Tiberius would specifically execute boys that he was no longer enjoying physically, if you get my drift. Once Tiberius felt that he had his fun with these boys, he would have them thrown off a cliff while he watched. But he was compassionate because he didn't have these boys thrown onto rock, he had these boys thrown into water. Obviously, being thrown into water could still lead to instant death or death by drowning, but there is a chance that these boys could survive. But don't worry, Tiberius definitely thought of this. So when he had these boys thrown off a cliff into the water, he had men in boats below waiting for these boys to land in the water where they could then break their bones with the oars if needed. So yeah, falling is definitely one of the most prehistoric and simple methods of execution, but in Italy, back in the day, they were using it for some very strange reasons. But let's move on. The United States. The upright jerker. I realize this execution method sounds like your nighttime routine, but trust me, it's not nearly as fun. You see, in the 19th and early 20th century, the United States was doing a lot of hangings. And as society began to get more civilized, they thought, maybe these public hangings everybody loves is a bit barbaric. We should definitely keep executing people in public, but let's do it differently. And the product of that thought was the upright jerker, which kind of sounds like a nickname you would give someone who sleepwalks and sleepwanks at the same time. Seriously though, where the upright jerker differed from the traditional hanging was as follows. Traditional hanging would take place on a gallows, typically high up with a trapdoor below the condemned person's feet. The executioner would open the trapdoor and the person would fall and the rope would snap their neck or quickly strangle them, with the weight of their body compressing their neck in the noose. During this time, there was a lot of high-profile botched hangings, which is why they decided to try something new, something that they thought would be more effective. The upright jerker differed from traditional hangings because instead of being dropped from a height onto your neck, you would start on the ground and actually be lifted up by your neck. This would happen with the same style of noose being connected to the victim's neck, although the rope would be connected to a series of pulleys that would be connected to weights. So when the executioner was ready, he would activate the system and the condemned person would be hoisted up into the air, typically instantly breaking their neck, and if not, similar to hanging, would slowly be strangulated to death. The name upright jerker comes from the victim obviously being upright and being shot into the air, but jerker refers to how the body would typically move after they would be flung into the air, because the pulley system would typically bounce the body up and down, jerking them. Definitely morbid. And an interesting take on hanging I haven't heard of until now. Sri Lanka. Crushing by elephant. I mean, you probably already get the idea, but I'm gonna give a bit more context because, believe it or not, there is some nuance to this. Unlike the very first example I talked about, this method was used on criminals. So we're at least off to a better start. How this execution method would work is after the justice system of the time would do its thing, and then the person was then sentenced to death, they would then have them ready for the elephant execution. How this would look is the condemned person would be put on a pedestal, typically a smooth stone surface, and then they would bring in the elephants. But here's the thing, the elephant could go one of many ways. Depending on how trained the elephant was, they would either walk the elephant back and forth over top of the person until the elephant accidentally stepped on the vitals of this person, or if the elephant was more trained, the elephant would deliberately step on the person's limbs, torso, and even head to quickly execute the individual. Pretty simple, but extremely brutal. But these weren't the only ways that they would use elephants to their advantage. In some cases, they wouldn't even have the elephant step on the person at all, at least not at first. They wouldn't start with the person laying down. They would allow the elephant to grab the person by their trunk and throw them around. And then, once they were thrown to the ground, the elephant would then, do its little moonwalk. This method was used not only in Sri Lanka, but also in India and other parts of Asia for quite a long time, and was even popular up into the late 19th century, although in modern times it's no longer used. However, the terrifying stories still remain. And if you plan on becoming a time-traveling criminal, I definitely wouldn't recommend doing anything in Sri Lanka during the 17th, 18th, or 19th century, unless you want to get up close and personal with Dumbo. China. Execution vans. Okay, so this is the first modern method on the list, and surprise, surprise, is one of the only modern methods, because a lot of the modern methods now are humane as they can be, and most places don't even do executions anymore. But leave it to China to give us an interesting entry for this list. And while most countries around the globe have been decreasing or even entirely eliminating the amount of executions they're doing every year, China is actually raising those numbers and has a plethora of laws that if you break, you can be executed, which is for that reason why they have the execution van, which is exactly what it sounds like. It is literally a van that is kitted out to kill criminals. From the outside, the van appears to be a 24-person bus, with its windows covered and with minimal police markings. But on the inside of this bus, it almost resembles a hospital room, although nobody in this van is going to be healed. Typically, how it would work is once you end up on a Chinese death row, instead of going to a part of the prison where you'd be executed, you would be picked up by the van. And once in the van, you'd be strapped down to an operating style table and then injected with a lethal injection. And at that point, driven likely to the morgue. Truthfully, finding publicly available information on China's mobile execution chambers is a bit tough, although it's definitely not a secret. These execution vans have been in use since 2003 and are still in use to this day. Although technically this method is only lethal injection, I think the fact that China has systematized it to a point where they've made it a literal mobile execution chamber for maximum efficiency definitely earns it a spot on this list. Just imagine living in China and seeing this thing though. Like in your everyday life, when you see a hearse go by, you get kind of a feeling or a thought. But if you see an execution van go by, I can't imagine the literal aura of that thing. Can't be good. Spain, the garrote. All right, buckle up. Things are really taking a dark turn now. The garrote was used in the 1800s and the 1900s and was used not only in Spain, but also in Spanish colonies, like the Philippines. And interestingly, the garrote was seen as a more merciful form of execution compared to the going technique of death by burning, which I'll let you make your own opinion on once I explain the garrote. The garrote consists of a small seat for you to sit on and a wooden plank going up your spine. Once in the seat, you would have a metal loop wrapped around your neck. And directly behind your head on the wooden post that your spine is aligned with would be essentially a big screw. And what this screw would do was actually twofold. Because as the executioner would turn the screw from behind your neck, a sharp piece of metal would slowly be pressing against the back of your neck. And with every turn, your neck would become crushed by the piece of metal literally securing your head to this post. And how this victim would die would vary. But the two most common methods were either one, having the person's brainstem literally explode due to the pressure from the spike going through the back of the neck, or if you were lucky, before you even got to that point, you were asphyxiated to death by the pressure on your neck through the metal loop. Regardless, the garrote is absolutely brutal. Just for a quick pop quiz, when do you think they stopped using this brutal device? The use was officially and finally abolished in 1978. Only 47 years ago. Chances are if you're watching this video, either your parents or possibly even yourself were alive during the time that this device was still in use. Some history isn't as far back as you think. Let's keep moving. Uzbekistan. Boiling alive. I'm going to preface this by saying that historically, boiling alive was used a lot in both England and China. But because we already talked about China and we're going to be speaking about England, I decided to pin this on Uzbekistan because they have the most recent recorded usage of this method. Now you might be asking yourself, what exactly is the method? And let me tell you. Death by boiling is when somebody boils not just water, but also animal fat, motor oil, cooking oil, or really any liquid of their choice, and then they would submerge their victim into this boiling liquid. And the result would be likely one of the most excruciating experiences humanly possible. And for that reason, it's on the list. Historically, Henry VIII made boiling the official execution method for anybody who committed murder via poisoning, as well as anybody who committed high treason. And during the 16th century in Japan, Japanese bandits were boiled alive as well. But in more modern times, specifically from 1991 all the way until 2016, Uzbekistan is alleged to have been boiling suspected terrorists on the regular. And this is kind of confirmed by a United States Department of State document from 2004, which confirmed that the Uzbekistan government had tortured 2 gang members, and their bodies were extensively bruised, burned, and reportedly submerged in boiling water as well, making that allegation a little bit more real. And since we're speaking about boiling people alive in the modern day, there's a documentary that came out in 2010 about sicarios, the Latin American gang. And during this documentary, during an interview with a sicario, the sicario claimed that the Mexican cartel would boil alive anybody found to be working for the police. And these people were boiled alive in oil until they were no longer alive. So even though in the modern day, no country has boiling alive on their menu of official execution methods, there are definitely places where it's still being done, which is a terrifying thought. Ancient Rome, penalty of the sack. Ancient Rome's got a lot of history, and interesting execution styles is part of that history. Now, truthfully, penalty of the sack kind of sounds like something you'd pay a dominatrix for. But in reality, it's just the translation of the original Latin word, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because, well, you guys roast me. And similar to the very first execution method that we talked about, this method of execution was reserved only for a specific crime. That crime being parricide, or killing a member of your immediate family. So at least it wasn't used on, someone just who was old. It was at least used on a murderer, but still, the question remains. What is the punishment of the sack? Whose sack is being punished? How do they punish the sack? And don't worry, it's at least 100 times worse than any form of cock and ball torture you could imagine. Okay, jokes aside, penalty of the sack went as follows. Someone would kill their parents, they would get caught, they would get convicted, then they are awaiting execution. Execution day comes, and this is how it plays out. The criminal is first put into either a barrel or a large burlap sack. The person is then told to curl up into a ball, and the bag or barrel that they are in is then either filled with snakes, monkeys, dogs, or chickens. And at that point, the barrel or sack is sealed, and then you are thrown into the water. So not only are you panicking in this small confined space while you are slowly drowning, you're also in there with a wild animal. Which, first of all, what did the animal do? What did this chicken, snake, dog, what did they do? They didn't do anything. That's just friendly fire. Imagine just being a chicken and getting caught in the crossfire because this guy killed his parents. Regardless, in ancient Rome, drowning was simply not enough. That's wild. Medieval Europe, rat torture. This method was pretty widely spread across all of Europe during the medieval era, so I'm just doing the region, not even the country. They were all guilty. Rat torture is definitely one of the most famous and one of the most brutal methods of execution likely ever used. And for that reason, you may already be familiar with this method. So I'll keep it brief. This method was used on any range of criminals, and although the method was considered torture, it essentially had a 99.99% fatality rate. Here's how it would work. You would be walked into the execution chamber, the dungeon, the medieval places where people died, and you would be strapped down. Once strapped down, you would have a rat placed typically on your stomach. And on top of that rat, they would place a small cage firmly on top of your stomach, trapping the rat onto your body. And now you officially have a pet rat. But unfortunately, this isn't the end of the torture method, as once this cage was secured to your body, the executioner would begin to apply typically heat to the rat to make it uncomfortable and force it to try to find a way out of this cage. And of course, it can't get through the metal cage, however, it could possibly burrow down. And that's exactly what would happen. This rat would begin to burrow and eat and scratch and claw through the person's body, typically going directly into their intestines, causing an excruciating and brutal experience that would typically not instantly kill you, but cause a slow, excruciating, painful death in anywhere from a few hours to even a few days in some cases. This death was typically brought on by a loss of blood or disease. And it's really as simple as that. I can't think of many things more brutal than having rats forced to burrow through your body while you're still alive. And yet, there's still one final entry on this list. England, drawing and quartering. For the final entry on this list, I knew there was only one suitable entry, that being drawing and quartering. Primarily because it's not even a single execution method. It is a combination of 3 used sequentially. And they intentionally keep you alive during the initial, I guess not even executions, just torture methods until they ultimately kill you. Drawing and quartering was reserved specifically for traitors. And this method was supremely brutal because they wanted to set a very strong example that if you were a traitor, that the consequences were above all else. And interestingly, this method of execution was actually so brutal that they didn't even do it on women. They only did it on men. This rule was in place because, spoiler alert, the men would be naked during part of this execution, and they figured it would be too indecent to do that to women. So instead, women only got beheaded or burned at the stake, which, as brutal as those are, they seem like child's play compared to drawing and quartering. So let's say you commit treason in medieval England. What exactly happens? First, you are removed from your jail cell and dragged by horse from the prison to the gallows. At that point, you are put on the gallows and hung, but not fully. You are only hung until you are half dead. Once the executioner feels that you are sufficiently hung, you are cut down. Once you are cut down, you are literally disemboweled, with the executioner removing your organs out of your body. And then the executioner will set your organs on fire. At that point, you are then beheaded. And then once you are beheaded, all 4 of your limbs are attached to separate horses, and the horses pull your body apart. And that is the long and short of drawing and quartering. And there was kind of variations on how this kind of happened, but this was the head honcho of all of the techniques used. Initially, I actually planned on putting tearing apart by animals on the list because that alone is an extremely brutal method of execution. But once I learned about drawing and quartering, I realized that I had to save being torn apart by any animal for the method that included that, along with 3 other literal execution methods. It's probably one of the most brutal execution methods of all time, and was extremely popular during medieval times, and was only abolished in the 19th century, which isn't super recent, but not super long ago either. How you would die on every planet. This is you on Mercury. This is you on Saturn. And this is you in Uranus. What's the commonality between all of these versions of you? Well, they're all dead. And that's because basically every planet in our solar system is uninhabitable. But today, we're gonna explain exactly how you got to all of these planets and what about these planets caused you such a harsh and painful death. And to do that, let's take a couple steps back before you died on any of these planets. You are the bravest astronaut this side of the Mississippi. And NASA has decided that now is the time that we embark on interplanetary travel. Luckily for you, NASA has developed a special technology that has granted you the perfect number of respawns to die on every planet and still come back in one piece. Because after all, they know that you're just a squishy little guy. And these planets are pretty crazy. But without further ado, let's get to our first planet and experience just exactly how it would kill you. You're now officially approaching the very first planet in the entire solar system, Mercury. Instantly, you're met with 2 options. Do you land on the light side, or do you land on the dark side? And although you're equipped with limited respawns, you understand that you have some wiggle room, and you decide to first land on the light side. One of the first things you notice as you descend closer and closer to the surface of Mercury is that you're experiencing very little atmospheric drag. And that's because there's actually no atmosphere on Mercury. Mercury only has a thin exosphere. When your rocket ship descends onto Earth, you notice the atmospheric drag and you feel the resistance. You can see the flames out of the window on the side of the ship. And that's because Earth has a strong atmosphere, but Mercury has no such thing, which already brings us to our first probable cause of death, which is a hard impact. Your spaceship isn't equipped for such a thin atmosphere, and for that reason, your landing is extra harsh. Although, miraculously, you and your ship survive. And you're now on the surface of Mercury. And before you even step out of your ship, you notice that the surface is bumpy and mountainous, and that's due to this lack of atmosphere. Just like how your ship experienced no atmospheric drag, meteorites don't either, meaning that they don't burn up when they enter the planet's exosphere. They keep going until they impact the ground hard, making the surface of Mercury look like an abandoned war zone. Regardless, you press the button, open the door, and you step foot onto the surface of Mercury. And within seconds, the spacesuit that your life depends on fails and begins to melt. The pressure that your spacesuit maintains to keep oxygen in the suit is gone due to burn holes that have appeared throughout the suit. And now you and your spacesuit are melting on the surface of Mercury, and before you're even able to gasp for air, your skin is boiling, your organs are shutting down, and you are dead before you can even asphyxiate from the lack of oxygen. That was probably quicker than you thought, but that's just the harsh reality of the light side side of Mercury. Because Mercury has no atmosphere and a very thin exosphere, you are directly exposed to the harsh sun in full effect. And what that looks like, at least for the warm side of the planet, is temperatures approaching 427 degrees Celsius, which, like I mentioned, is enough to essentially cook you in seconds. But it doesn't just stop there, because not only does the lack of atmosphere not protect you from the sun's heat and radiation, but the lack of atmospheric pressure also means that the boiling point of water is significantly lower, which means that not only would all of your organs fail due to the sheer heat your body is experiencing, but also all of your bodily fluids would almost instantly evaporate. So yeah, the light side of Mercury is nothing to mess with, and the sheer unprotected exposure to the sun would kill, vaporize, and melt you in a matter of seconds. And even if it didn't, even if you were the most heat-resistant person in the world, there's also no oxygen, which kind of just seems like a cliff note at this point, but it is true, there's still no oxygen, even if you could survive this heat. You've respawned safely in your spaceship, and you've decided that you're just gonna wait for night to come to you. And you wait 1 hour, 8 hours, 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours. And at this point, you're curious if night's ever going to come. And the reality is, it likely won't come for a long time. And that's because Mercury rotates extremely slow, meaning that 1 day on Mercury is actually 176 days on Earth. So instead of waiting a half year for nighttime to come, you decide to fly your ship to the dark side of Mercury to see if that's any more inhabitable. Your ship lands and it's dark, although the lights on your ship and the distant glimmer of stars is enough to illuminate the surface of the planet for you to kind of walk around. You press the button, open the ship door, and take your first steps onto the surface of Mercury during nighttime. Instantly, you're relieved that you're not melting or having your blood boil, but you're now realizing what you are dealing with: a severe lack of heat. The nighttime temperatures on Mercury can get as low as negative 180 degrees Celsius, which may seem strange because this planet is the closest to the sun, but due to the lack of atmosphere, Mercury is very poorly insulated and not able to maintain and spread this heat across the planet, leaving you with almost only two extremes. After spending a few seconds on the surface, you realize that your spacesuit is once again not equipped for the sheer lack of heat, and you notice the cold to begin to penetrate your suit and cause severe internal damage. Your visor is instantly fogged up from your breath. Your nose, fingers, and toes are instantly turned numb and turning black with frostbite. At a molecular level, ice crystals are forming inside of your cells, causing internal damage, and your body is beginning to shut down. You can try to move around all you want to try to generate more body heat, but it's simply not going to work. And even if your spacesuit is able to maintain pressure and give you oxygen, within a few minutes, hypothermia will set in and you will be dead. You once again respawn in your ship and realize that there is a third option for landing, a potential Goldilocks zone. You notice that the daytime is too harsh and the nighttime is too harsh. However, there is a strip in the middle of the planet where night meets day, and you decide to land there. Scientifically, and this is real, this area is known as the Terminator Zone, and it's the most moderate place on the entire planet, which is kind of ironic. Regardless, you fly to the Terminator Zone, you land, and you step out of the ship. The part of the Terminator Zone that you find yourself in is on the warm side, not the cold side. You're experiencing more of the sun exposure. However, it's not nearly to the same degree that you experienced on the daytime side, although this moderate temperature still far exceeds the temperature that your NASA spacesuit is able to tolerate. And I guess that this is a good time to mention, because in this hypothetical, we're using NASA's most current flagship spacesuit, which is rated to tolerate temperatures up to 121 degrees Celsius and as cold as negative 157 degrees Celsius, meaning that the suit definitely gives you a huge advantage over being, well, naked, but it's simply no match for the harsh conditions of Mercury. And for that reason, you once again find yourself dead within minutes. Leaving Mercury with your captain's logs full, you now make your way to the next planet in the solar system: Venus. Not to be confused with Penis. I don't know what happened there, but yeah, we're heading to Venus. Your ship is now orbiting Venus, and you begin your descent into this mysterious red-looking planet. As you descend closer to the surface of this planet, you can't help but notice the sheer opposites that you have just experienced. As you're descending closer to the surface of Venus, you are seeing clouds almost everywhere. Thick clouds at that. It's almost like a dark fog, and the closer you get to the surface of Venus, the darker things have become, which in contrast to Mercury is total night and day, because Mercury had no atmosphere, meaning no clouds, no air resistance, nothing. Venus, on the other hand, has an abundance of air pressure, meaning that your landing is relatively easy and light. But the pleasantries of Venus are about to end. Your ship gently lands on the surface and almost instantly begins to make creaking noises. These are noises you haven't yet heard from your ship, but you continue on. You press the button, open the bay door, and step onto the surface of Venus, where you're met with familiar and extremely unfamiliar problems. The first familiar problem is the extreme heat. The surface of Venus is actually hotter than the surface of Mercury, reaching temperatures of 464 degrees Celsius, which is hot enough to melt lead. And because of this, like on Mercury, the integrity of your suit is compromised, you have lost all air, your skin is melting, your liquids are evaporating, and you are dead within seconds. But let's just say, hypothetically, if your suit was able to handle this amount of heat, well, you wouldn't last much longer at all. And that's because Venus has a very unique atmosphere. Atmospheric pressure is sometimes calculated in bar. And for example, on Earth at sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 1 bar. If you've ever seen a watch that's waterproof, it might say 5 bar or something along those lines, and that just means it can tolerate higher pressure from being underwater. Well, the atmospheric pressure on Venus is 92 bar, meaning that its atmosphere is 92 times denser than Earth's. So even though Venus is a similar size to Earth and the gravity you would experience on this planet is relatively similar, because of the sheer atmospheric pressure, as soon as you step foot on this planet, your body would almost instantly collapse. This amount of atmospheric pressure is almost equivalent to being 1.6 kilometers under the ocean. But not only would movement be extremely hard and your body would even struggle to stand, but the sheer amount of pressure would also instantly rupture your eardrums and force all of the air out of your lungs. And if those things for some reason didn't kill you, the collapsing of all of your blood vessels definitely would. And as your dead body lays on the surface of Venus, it begins to rain. But this rain isn't any regular rain. This rain from the clouds that you saw is sulfuric acid, which at this point is basically just adding insult to injury. Because not only does your body essentially instantly vaporize, but it's also crushed and then melted by the acidic rain and fog that exists almost everywhere on this hellish planet. There's no Goldilocks zone or Terminator zone or good zone on Venus. It's all a thick fog of acid, extreme heat, extreme pressure, and it's extremely not fun. You respawn on your ship moments before the structural integrity of that collapses, and you begin your journey to your next planet. This planet looks familiar, but you just can't quite put your finger on it. You can see white, fluffy clouds from the atmosphere, huge, beautiful blue oceans, vast green landscapes, and vast brown deserts. You pick a random spot and decide to descend. The first place you decide to descend is an island just off the coast of India. You know that you're on Earth and realize that you likely don't even need your spacesuit, but you keep it on anyway. You press the button, open the door, and you walk onto this island off the coast of India. And instantly you realize that you're on North Sentinel Island. You try to turn around and get back to your ship, but you get an arrow through both of your knees, and before you can even say a prayer, you have been killed. And realize that maybe landing on North Sentinel Island wasn't the best place to land. You respawn in your ship, fly back up to orbit, and pick another location, this time on an island off the coast of Brazil, far away from India and any sort of uncontacted tribe, right? You land your ship, you open the door, and you step onto this island to realize that there's no people here at all. You can breathe. You take off your helmet and enjoy being home for once. Until you realize multiple snakes slithering up your legs, and you now have multiple venomous snakes in your spacesuit, and you're currently dying on Snake Island. You respawn in your ship, fly back up to orbit, and realize you're done. You're not going to any more uninhabited islands. You pick somewhere central in the United States and decide to land. You press the map, you open the door, and you realize that you've just landed in Gary, Indiana. You take your first few steps to admire the abandoned buildings. But before you know it, your spaceship is being stolen and sold for drugs, your space boots are being stolen off your feet, and you've just been stabbed for wearing a fancy-looking spacesuit. You lasted a noble 20 seconds. Obviously, I'm just being satirical here. There's more ways you could die on Earth than I could ever possibly mention. Although, if you did want to watch a couple videos about how you could die on Earth, there's a lot of videos on my channel that go into detail about that. You respawn in your spaceship, take a deep breath, and prepare for your next planet. You're approaching Mars, and already you're kind of scarred from red-looking planets, but you know that this planet is different, and you're excited to see how different this planet really is. You orbit the planet, and then begin your descent to the surface of Mars. Upon your descent, you're pleased to see that there is no sulfuric acid clouds or rain or gas anywhere, although you realize that's likely a result of the low atmospheric pressure that exists on Mars. And unfortunately, we now know the result of low atmospheric pressure. You have another harsh landing due to the lack of air resistance, and after the reddish dust settles from your impact, you open the door and take your first steps onto the surface of Mars. It's daytime, and you're pleasantly surprised because the temperature is extremely moderate. During the daytime, the temperature of Mars only gets to around 20 degrees Celsius, which is comfortable. Because of the distance that we now are from the sun, the temperature is not nearly as severe as it was on Mercury. However, there is still a big difference with the lack of atmosphere, and it's kind of twofold. The first issue is the radiation from the sun is still strong, 40 to 50 times stronger than it is on the Earth, which is concerning. And also, when nighttime comes and the heat from the sun is no longer available, the temperatures can get as cold as negative 153 degrees Celsius, which would kill you in a similar fashion as to what we explained before. But because we know how you would die on an extremely cold planet, and because you landed during the daytime on Mars, let's just discuss this situation. You're on the surface of Mars, the temperature is pleasant, and so far, things are looking good. Mars is the second most habitable planet in our solar system, and is the most likely candidate to be a place where people could live, although that doesn't necessarily mean it's habitable at all. Besides the lack of atmosphere and extremely cold temperatures, Mars's air is almost solely comprised of carbon dioxide, which, if you try to breathe, would cause a panic attack and hypoxia and then suffocation, all within minutes. Although within your spacesuit, that's not an issue for now. However, what is an issue is the radiation exposure and severe sandstorms. And the sandstorms on Mars are intense. Winds can approach 100 kilometers per hour, and the abrasive nature of the sand could easily strip the paint off your spaceship, wear down your spacesuit, and essentially turn your helmet's visor from clear glass into frosted glass in a few minutes. But even still, you're not quite dead yet. And throughout the rest of the day on Mars, you could live, assuming you have at least enough oxygen in your spacesuit to explore the barren surface. Although, when night comes, temperatures will drop and you will be no longer. You respawn on the ship and head off to your next planet. And this is the beginning of things getting really crazy. As you approach the next planet, you realize something different. This planet is massive. It's not only the biggest planet that we've explored so far, but it's also the biggest planet in the entire solar system. This planet is Jupiter. And as you begin to successfully orbit this planet, you realize something. You're experiencing radiation sickness. And that's because Jupiter is extremely toxic. And before you can even get anywhere near the surface of Jupiter, which we'll discuss that in a second, you are going to be feeling the effects of the extreme radiation that comes from this toxic planet. But assuming you and your suit are built different, you begin your descent into the planet of Jupiter. One of the first things that you're going to experience is the strange upper clouds. They're not made of sulfuric acid like on Venus. These clouds are lighter in color and composed of water vapor and ammonia. The temperature that we're already experiencing on the descent is already more than our suit can handle. But you're still in your ship and you're still safe for now. So you continue to descend. You notice things similar to Venus begin to get darker and darker, but more intensely than it did on Venus. And with that, you're also noticing that your ship is creaking, similar to what it did on Venus, meaning that the atmospheric pressure is getting intense. You would think that with Jupiter being so massive, its gravitational forces would be huge as well, but Jupiter's gravity is only about 2.4 times stronger than the gravity we experience here on Earth. As your descent continues and you're looking out the window, it's nearly pitch black and you can't see anything. Light isn't able to make it this deep onto the planet, and the pressure is getting intense. Even just 50 kilometers into the planet of Jupiter will have you experiencing pressure equivalent to around 1,000 bar. Keep in mind, the pressure on Venus was 92 bar. You're only 50 kilometers into Jupiter, and you're experiencing 1,000 bar pressure. Now, if you weren't in your indestructible ship, you would have frozen and been crushed into a ball long ago. But because you're in your ship, you're still continuing further. As the pressure increases and as you go deeper and deeper into the planet of Jupiter, one thing that you notice is peculiar is that it's no longer cold. It's actually hot, really hot. You notice that the temperature gauge on the outside of the ship is over 1,000 degrees Celsius, which, if you were exposed to, would instantly vaporize you. But because you're in your ship, you're still safe and still continuing deeper into the planet. At this point, you're struggling to decide when you can even get out of the ship and if you can at all. Because at this point, you've experienced extreme cold, extreme pressure, extreme heat, and now you're experiencing extreme storms with winds up to 400 kilometers per hour. And there's still no sign of any solid surface for you to land your ship on. You notice your ship reach something. It's not ground, but it's a liquidy surface, and it's good enough for you. You press the button, open the spaceship door, you step onto this surface of metallic hydrogen where your feet essentially get stuck and your body is instantly crushed and melted before you can even process what happened. Jupiter's a bit of a tough one because the deeper you go, the more hypothetical you get. And right now, the kind of going theory is that there is a core of metallic hydrogen and other heavy metals in liquid form, potentially surrounding a solid core, but also potentially not. The pressure and temperatures at the core of Jupiter are unimaginably intense. And in the instance of this experiment, this is as deep as you're gonna go, because your mission was to find out how you would die on Jupiter, not what the core of Jupiter is. Although that mission might have been a more productive mission to go on. However, right now the theory is actually that the core of Jupiter could potentially be hotter than the surface of the sun, which, if true, is just crazy to think about. But you don't have time to think, because you're already on your way to your next planet. And this planet, once again, poses brand new challenges. The challenges with surviving this planet begin with even getting close to it, because not only does Saturn have a plethora of moons, 146 as of now, but it also has its huge, massive, and cool rings, which are literally just orbiting pieces of older moons that crashed into each other or exploded for, I guess, other reasons. So before we even get close to this planet, we have a game of Space Invaders avoiding asteroids and moon debris. But because you're a legend, you avoid all of that and you begin to get closer to Saturn, and you realize that you're going to be experiencing a lot of similarities to Jupiter. Specifically because this planet is once again massive, and it's also comprised out of the same gases, helium and hydrogen. So you already know you're in for a world of pain. Literally a world of pain. Since the composition of Saturn is relatively similar to the composition of Jupiter, you decide that you're not going to wait until you reach some sort of core to get out of your spaceship. You're going to make sure that you're deep enough into the planet where it's dark and you know that you're fully immersed within the planet's contents, and then you're going to see what happens. And that's exactly what you did. You begin breaking through the initial clouds, and instantly you're once again met with ammonia crystals in the air and clouds and a thicker and denser fog. Your ship begins to descend slowly, your windows get covered in frost, and it begins to get darker and darker. And you realize that it's time to step out of the ship and see what happens. You press the button, the door opens, you step out, and you jump into the abyss. As soon as you step off of the ledge, you're not falling straight down. You are smacked by 1,800 km/h winds throwing you in multiple directions, as Saturn is experiencing consistent storms that would literally rip your body apart almost instantly. At this point, assuming you're extremely damaged but not killed, your body flying around and spinning out of control begins to fall deeper into Saturn. Already, the extreme cold is freezing you and killing you within your spacesuit, and the pressure is only getting more and more intense. But because on this particular day you were feeling extra resilient, you're able to survive these extremely cold temperatures and this wind and this intense pressure. You realize that the further you fall, once again, the warmer it gets. And the pressure only gets more and more bone crushing, until soon enough, your body lands into this metallic liquid surface, and your body is now literally a drop in the bucket. What used to be a human body in a spacesuit is now a vaporized liquid drop in an unbelievably hot core of a gas giant planet. You respawn in your ship. Fortunately, it's close to the surface. You exit this planet, make it through the minefield of moons and moon fragments once again, and you're out of the woods. You're no longer going into gas giants, but you're now getting into ice giants. And these planets aren't much better at all. And that's because they are still literally gas giants. They're not made of ice. They are just comprised of elements that are heavier than helium. And they are obviously extremely cold. Approaching the next planet in the first ice giant, you once again have to navigate a minefield of moon fragments. And once you've successfully navigated that, you are met with a beautiful sight. You look outside the window and bestow your eyes upon Uranus. Obviously, upon seeing it, the first thing you want to do is just get inside it. You need to penetrate Uranus to see what's inside, right? That's what this mission is all about. So before you could even orbit this planet, you simply begin to descend. And soon enough, you're penetrating the surface of Uranus. One of the first things that you notice is how dark it is at this part of the solar system. You are so far from the sun that even on the surface of Uranus, the surface level clouds, it is already pretty dark, and it's only gonna get darker the deeper you go. Upon penetrating Uranus, you're met with unbreathable and some toxic gases, with the majority of Uranus's atmosphere being comprised of hydrogen, helium, and methane, none of which are breathable for humans. But you've got your spacesuit on, and you're still in your ship, so you continue to dive deeper. It's not long before you notice the extreme cold, with temperatures already reaching negative 195 degrees Celsius, which, if you were outside, would be enough to almost instantly kill you. But you're still in your ship and still descending deeper into Uranus. And now you are getting into the heart of some of these storms happening on Uranus, with winds up to 900 km/h. Winds that could potentially be fatal and at the very least mess you up horribly. And as you continue to descend, it is extremely dark, the winds are horrible, and now your ship is being pelted, initially by ice-like crystals. And the deeper you go, you notice that these aren't crystals anymore. These are fully formed diamonds being pelted at your spaceship at over 900 km/h, something you haven't seen up until now. And at this moment, you're inspired to get out. You still haven't met any sort of solid surface yet, but you park your ship by hovering it, you press the button, and step out. You step into a 900 km/h gust of wind, and instantly are pelted with another gust of wind carrying diamonds in the opposite direction, going again 900 km/h, having your entire body be penetrated by these diamond fragments. And while you are dying and bleeding out and asphyxiating due to all of the holes in your spacesuit, you begin to notice the immense pressure crushing your body smaller and smaller in the intense heat that now exists at this deeper level. Uranus is regarded as the coldest planet in the solar system, but at this point, near the core of the planet, it is extremely hot, and you are being crushed, melted, vaporized, and pelted with diamonds. A fate quite similar to the last few you experienced, although this one at least includes diamonds, which is cool. But I think at this point it's safe to say, playing in Uranus can definitely get dangerous. You're back on your ship, safe, and you're happy to be out of Uranus. So you quickly head to the final planet on this list, the second and final ice giant, that being Neptune. Now, I'll be honest, Neptune is extremely similar to Uranus as far as composition and what exactly would happen if you were to experience this planet. And because I can't make as many puns with this planet, I'm gonna keep this one relatively brief. Assuming you penetrate the surface of Neptune and decide to park the ship there and simply jump into the void, you would experience extremely cold temperatures, followed by extreme winds, and then rising temperatures and rising pressure until you're pelted by, once again, diamond rain, and then disintegrated into the darkness and abyss that is the core of Neptune. A story similar to the previous planets, but no less severe. Your death on Neptune, while instant, would be horrible. You respawn on your ship, and before heading back to Earth, you realize that you still have one respawn left. And because this is Trust Me Bro, and we're always extra, we decide to head to the forgotten planet of our lifetime. The dwarf planet that still exists in our solar system, but is no longer recognized as an official planet, and that would be Pluto. One of the first ways you could die in regards to Pluto is dying of boredom, because Pluto is so damn far away. But because we have Instagram Reels, you're able to entertain yourself for the entirety of the trip, and you are now orbiting the dwarf planet that nobody loves. You make your descent onto the surface of this planet, and you can only help but notice how small it is. It almost reminds you of the moon. But as you look back towards the sun, you notice something you haven't seen before. The sun, at this point, almost looks like a star in the distance. Sure, you can tell it's the sun, but it's at this point exceedingly small, and much smaller than it was when you were on Mercury. And speaking of Mercury, you notice once again that Pluto has almost no atmosphere, meaning that your landing was rough and you are in for some extremely strange experiences. Being this far from the sun means that it's dark and cold all of the time. And this is something that at this point you're just prepared for. You hit the button and step into negative 229 degrees Celsius temperatures, a temperature that you may notice is actually colder than liquid nitrogen. And because the surface of this planet is colder than liquid nitrogen, you would essentially experience what it would feel like to jump into a pool of liquid nitrogen. Any liquid on or around your body would instantly be boiled, and your skin would feel like it's almost burning. We've reached temperatures so cold they feel hot once again. Your skin would freeze, and all of your flesh, including your muscles, your fat, your everything, begin to turn into a frigid, hard solid. Every cell in your body would die and turn black, and your dark, mummified body would essentially live on as a statue on the surface of Pluto, literally frozen in time. And my only hope for you would be that you left yourself in a funny position, if you even had time to get there. And with that, you use your last respawn, you get back in your ship, and you head back to Earth. You have multiple logbooks full of your experience being documented, and once you return to NASA and hand in this information, they regretfully inform you that they appreciate you going on this trip, but they actually just developed a drone that could have done all of this. And the worst part is, they actually developed it before you left. But because you seemed so excited about going, they didn't want to break your spirit, so they let you go anyway. But at least you got to play in Uranus. The craziest cave rescue missions ever. If you're anything like me, then you guys have spent a lot of time at 2 a.m. watching YouTube. And for some reason, we all end up in the same rabbit hole, watching those insane caving videos. You know, the guys with loving families at home who just decide that they need to shove themselves through 2-inch cracks, 100 feet under the ground, while half underwater and covered in spiders. And at this point, it's even a meme to make fun of these crazy cave people. All over TikTok, people are just putting shoes over cracks and being like, oh, look at me, I'm a caver, which is honestly hilarious. But in this video, we're going deep, no pun intended. Today, we're discussing rescue missions, but I'm putting a twist on this video. These rescue missions could either be successful or unsuccessful, and you won't know the outcome until the end of the story. So buckle up and don't get too attached to the characters in these stories. Let's begin. Thunder Canyon. This story gets seriously intense and involves a software engineer who went on a cave expedition with an experienced group and ended up fighting for his life. Brent Colvin is a 39-year-old software engineer from Valley Center, California. And due to the fact that he was an engineer, he was a very meticulous planner, especially when it came to planning unique adventures. And his trip to Thunder Canyon was no different. It's important to note that Brent is not an unexperienced caver and has been caving for years and is considered by many an intermediate to advanced caver. And the group group of cavers he was about to embark on this expedition on were even more experienced than him. Thunder Canyon is a legendary cave for a few reasons. For starters, it's extremely elusive and is not marked anywhere, and it's only known within the caving community. And even learning the coordinates or general location of this cave system is more or less of a privilege. That aura for a lot of cavers already is so enticing, but it doesn't end there. The cave itself is dynamic. It's deep, dark, open in some places, wet in some places, tight in some places, and it almost sounds like I'm not describing a cave, but trust me, I am. Personally, it's hard to imagine a cave seeming enticing. However, if caving is your thing, Thunder Canyon had everything you wanted. It was rare, unique, and there was also many ways to approach it, as there was multiple entrances and exits that have been mapped out by other cavers. On Sunday, May 3rd, 2010, Brian and 6 other experienced cavers found themselves en route to Thunder Canyon, which included a short drive down an abandoned dirt road, and then from there a 2-mile hike to even get close to one of the elusive entrances to Thunder Canyon. After doing some searching, they find one of the entrances at 11 a.m. and the excursion begins. Upon entering this cave, they descend, and shortly after, without a hitch, the entire team clears the first obstacle. However, after this first rappel was a much larger task. It was an 80-foot drop. Now, it's important to note that this isn't just a rappel either. This rappel is a descent into darkness, going through a literal underground waterfall that lands you into a underground puddle of almost freezing cold water. But for cavers, this is all part of the thrill. The guide, Luca, is the first to rappel, and shortly after, the other cavers rappel as well, until they are all safely at their first checkpoint. At this point, it was obvious that some of the cavers were already feeling the pressure of what this cave was about to bring, and the guide even gave everybody an out, saying it's only going to get worse from here, and if you want to get out now. There is about to be tight squeezes, it's only going to get colder, and the trip has just begun. But even with some unsure faces, everybody continued on the journey. After completing a few rooms and rappelling twice more, the group meets their first fissure, aka one of these claustrophobic holes, which was literally named the Terrible Traverse. And it's called that because it takes a right angle into a 9-inch wide crack. A gap so tight that you can't even turn your head. And not only is it tight, the gap is also deep. 200 feet deep from top to bottom. It's important to note that the group reached this fissure at 3 p.m., 4 hours into their caving journey. And this fissure was one of the last things standing in their way before they were at the exit of the planned route. And it was, of course, at this fissure where everything was going to take a terrible turn. The guide of this expedition goes through this crack first. Without a hitch, he's done it many times. Next up, one of the least experienced cavers goes through this gap, and he, unfortunately, gets stuck. And not only does he get stuck, but he panics. He had never been pinned like this before and was freaking out, and none of the other cavers were going to be able to help him until he calmed down. However, within 5 minutes, the guide was able to calm him down, and within 10 minutes, the guide and the other cavers were able to pull him through and assist him out of the cave. After that slight hiccup, 3 other cavers in your party make it through this fissure, and it's at that point when the guide takes all of the other cavers out of the group, leaving Brent to cross this fissure all by himself. A reasonable decision because Brent was an experienced caver and had experience in this specific cave. However, Brent hadn't experienced the Terrible Traverse, and this experience would be one that he would never forget. It's important to note that Brent was very nervous about trying this gap, and he didn't even know that the guide had left with the other cavers. So it was simply just Brent and his final buddy behind him in the cave. Regardless, Brent began moving through the Terrible Traverse. One of the biggest challenges associated with this fissure is the fact that you're not just walking through a gap or crawling through a gap. You have to move feet first down the length of the crack, and then angle your body sideways to shimmy along before dropping down a 5-foot gap where you could then get your footing and squeeze through to the exit. Just to be extra cautious, Brent removed his wetsuit to ensure he had as much space as possible. However, after inserting his body fully into this fissure, he was almost instantly stuck. He could feel the tension of the rocks on his chest. His hips were wedged between the walls, and the only thing supporting his body was his hand. He couldn't move in any direction, and it was at that point when he realized he was stuck. After being stuck for what felt like an eternity, the guide returned, only to notice Brent was stuck. And after 2 hours of their best efforts, Brent was no closer to being free and was actually beginning to slip deeper and deeper down this fissure. Due to the stress of believing that he would not make it out alive, Brent became rather lucid. And the final caver behind him, James, was simply telling him stories to try to keep him awake and conscious. And it wasn't until 6:40 p.m., almost 4 hours later, that the San Bernardino Mountain Rescue Team was actually notified and mobilized to the position. After 7 hours of Brent being stuck, the guide side was signaling to a rescue helicopter that was sent, as the initial rescue team that showed up was simply not equipped to help Brent. And although the helicopter spotted them and help was on the way, it took an additional 4 hours for the helicopter to find a safe place to land and the specialized team to get on site. At this point, there was a very real risk of hypothermia for Brent and compartment syndrome, which is essentially when your chest is compressed for a long period of time, exposing you to the risk of cardiac arrest. Brent dying in his stuck position was a very real situation, and was only becoming more and more likely as more time passed. Once the rescue team finally was able to reach Brent within the cave, they explained exactly how severe the situation was, and their first order of business was keeping him as warm as possible, as he had no wetsuit on and his body was trapped between two rocks that were much colder than his body temperature, essentially drawing heat out of his body. The rescuers put heat packs around Brent and even gave him an electrolyte beverage. But with Brent and the final caver, at this point hypothermic, the rescuers had to move quick to save these individuals. As the rescue team began to attempt to move Brent, it was obvious that this was going to be a painful experience, as his ribs were tightly wedged between two rocks. And as they began pulling at his feet, Brent was screaming in pain, and the rescue team even asked Brent if they should stop pulling him, and it's reported that Brent literally replied, "I don't care if you break my ribs, just get me out of here." The rescuers used as much leverage as possible to lift the wooden board that bridged the gap in this fissure that was supporting Brent, and they used anchors to try to lift his body to pull him out. And with many failed attempts, they were able to move him 1, 2, 3 inches until they had him in a spot where their only option was to begin pulling his feet and essentially yanking him out of this cave. Brent's condition deteriorated deeper and deeper, and at 3:40 a.m., nearly 15 hours after entering the cave, Brent was pulled free out of the cave and rescued. After Brent was led out of the cave, the final caver quickly squeezed through the fissure without an issue, and the entire team survived this expedition. And after everything was said and done, it took over 13 people to help rescue Brent. I thought I'd start this video on a happy note. Yeah, Brent survived, fortunately. But I could not imagine what that experience would be like. And truthfully, I don't even want to paint a picture because I don't even want to imagine it. Being stuck sideways, dark, hypothermic, and lucid has to be just awful. And believe it or not, Brent promised himself that he would continue caving after this. Although he did say he would avoid tight squeezes, so at least there's that. At least he made it. But that might not be the case for this next story. The Peruvian Intimeche Cave. Cecilio Lopez Tercero is a lifelong caver and adventure lover, and whether it be a natural talent or simply because of his lifelong experience and fascination, Cecilio had a very particular skill for navigating caves and squeezing through extremely tight gaps, seemingly with ease and almost no fear. He is a respected cave explorer, and at the time of this story, he is considered a veteran caver. Cecilio was even a member of the Madrid rescue group, meaning that he was more qualified than anybody, not only to save people, but also to explore caves safely. He was one of Spain's most renowned rescuers and cavers. Cecilio was Spanish, but due to his unique skills, he was taken on expeditions around the world to navigate caves that no one else would dare, and to map out caves that no one else could. I think you guys get the idea. This guy was a pro. Cecilio had heard of this obscure and rare cave system in the mountains of Peru through some of his colleagues. And when he learned that there was a potential for there to be never before seen artifacts or structures, he was instantly on board. And the expedition was set. And Cecilio and 9 of his colleagues began their expedition into the Intimeche Cave in the Peruvian Andes. The Intimeche Cave was reported to be at least a mile long and at least 1,200 feet deep. And Cecilio was curious how much deeper and longer it was and what secrets were hidden down in the bottom of this cave. Like any professional, Cecilio studied meticulously, learning of all of the risks associated with this cave. With the expedition underway, Cecilio led his group of colleagues into this cave on a multi-day expedition. And the first few days went on without any issues. Notes were taken, beautiful sights were seen, and everything was going to plan. But as they got deeper and deeper into the cave, the squeezes only got tighter, and the map only got more vague. After multiple days in this cave, the challenging physical aspect was obvious and accounted for, but the mental aspect was starting to take a toll as well, as these people at this point had been in complete darkness for days, only seeing the light of their headlamp. And the cave that they are hundreds of feet into is completely silent, only broken by the sounds of water dripping. It wasn't until what would have been one of the last days of the expedition that tragedy struck, and it was during a rappel portion of the cave. Cecilio was about to descend a modest 15 meters into the next room, known as the 13 days room. And it was at this point, after the anchor was set and he began rappelling, that he heard a cracking noise. His anchor had failed, and Cecilio was in a free fall, falling 15 meters onto hard rock. Cecilio somehow avoided all of the razor-sharp rocks covering the floor of this room. However, he lied there motionless, in extreme pain, and with a suspected broken back. After regaining consciousness, Cecilio came to the harsh reality of his situation. He lied helpless, deep in a cave that was already in an extremely remote and treacherous location, 400 miles away from Lima, Peru. He knew he needed to be rescued, but he also knew it was not going to be easy. One of Cecilio's colleagues carefully climbed down to where Cecilio was to assess the situation and realized how grim it was. One of the cavers in this party left to get help, and the others stayed with Cecilio to help monitor his health. Fortunately, Cecilio survived a fall that could have easily been fatal for some. However, now he has to survive what would likely be the most grueling days of his life, as after he fell and sustained these injuries, it would take almost a week for rescue personnel to make it to where Cecilio was. Keep in mind, Cecilio was in a deep, remote cave located on the top of a mountain, where the entrance of the cave was at over 10,000 feet in altitude. When this medical team finally was able to find the location of the cave, hike over 10,000 feet to the cave entrance, and then begin the wild journey to where Cecilio was in the bottom of this extremely advanced cave, they weren't even there to help him escape. They were simply there to provide comfort measures and assess his health. They built a makeshift base camp and began administering morphine to provide comfort to the injured man that the medical team didn't know if they'd be bringing out dead or alive. Because Cecilio was still alive, removing him was going to be an extremely complicated feat, and it couldn't simply drag him by his feet, and he, unable to feel his legs, was unable to help himself as well. The medical team brought a rigid stretcher that was specifically designed to help carefully drag Cecilio out without jolting or repositioning his body, risking injuring him even worse. With medical measures in place, it was up to the other cavers to request specialized help. And initially, the Spanish government was unwilling to send a rescue team, and then they turned to the Peruvian government, both of which who denied to send help to save Cecilio's life. Cecilio's colleagues did the only thing they could do. They reached out to the Madrid Caving Society and also turned to social media, begging for support to help save their dear friend's life. They did everything they could to pressure the Spanish government into saving one of their most valuable cavers. Now, this is where things get interesting. Once some of Cecilio's friends from back home caught news of this, they immediately flew to Peru to help save them themselves. That is real friendship. And by the time these amazing friends were on the scene, there was already a small village at this cave entrance, consisting of medical staff, rescuers, and volunteers. Don't forget, this cave entrance is extremely remote and over 10,000 feet in altitude. It's not an easy place to be. And once again, keep in mind that this cave is extremely advanced, and many of the volunteers and rescue personnel that were dispatched are simply not equipped for this level of cave. And it would be only more of a liability for them to even attempt to save Cecilio. By the time that this rescue mission was fully underway, there was volunteer cave experts from Spain, France, Mexico, Peru, and over 40 Peruvian firefighters and military personnel actively involved in the rescue of Cecilio. And yet, there was still major challenges that took place. These 40 people need to eat, drink, they need to communicate with others, meaning that all of the progress that they're able to make is delayed significantly due to their lack of supplies, only adding more and more complexity to this seemingly impossible rescue mission. With this global team of experts on site ready to help Cecilio, they began the exploration into the cave. And once they reached Cecilio, they even explained their plan to him and got his professional insight on the escape that they had planned. And then they built a base camp 900 feet into the cave and began to set a complex series of anchor points across the entire cave so that they could essentially hoist the stretcher with Cecilio on it without him taking much more damage. On the 12th day, when they began drawing the stretcher out of the deep cave, things took a turn for the worse, as on this day, winds were higher than normal. The weather was unfavorable, and rain was adding an entirely new level of complexity into this rescue mission. Despite the heavy winds, a rescue helicopter was able to take the freshly rescued Cecilio to the nearest hospital, where he was treated, and after many months of treatment, he amazingly made a full recovery. The case of Cecilio Lopez is literally insane, and honestly a bit heartwarming to see how passionate people were about saving this man's life, likely because of all of the lives that Cecilio impacted during his time as a rescuer himself. If it wasn't for nearly 50 people from across the globe, not to mention local volunteers and villagers in the area, Cecilio would have never made it out of this cave and simply would have died. Call it luck or call it karma, Cecilio had something or somebody watching over him. Cecilio is a gangster, and the story is a clear example of how resilient the human body and mind can be. But we still have one more to discuss: the Chilean miner rescue. This rescue mission is by far the most intense we've talked about on this list, and is likely one of the most intense cave rescue missions ever conducted. As the title suggests, this rescue mission isn't of cavers who went down a deep, crazy, uncharted cave. This rescue mission is rescuing miners working in a gold and copper mine. And unfortunately, what started as a regular day on the job ended up becoming a multi-month global affair. Let me explain. On August 5th, 2010, 33 miners entered the San Jose cave in Chile. But that night, none of these miners leave that cave. The San Jose cave is over 100 years old and it stretches over 10 miles of confusing corridors. Some of these mine shafts go almost a mile deep into the ground. But for these miners, this was a normal day at work. And shortly after 2 a.m., a collapse had happened, leaving these miners trapped. The San Jose mine, which was owned by the San Esteban Mining Company, was known for its notoriously unsafe work conditions, and the company had reportedly even ignored warnings from the Chilean Safety Administration. And unfortunately, today was the day that what the Chilean government had warned about would happen. After hearing a huge rumbling noise and literally feeling the earth shake below them, these miners, unaware that they have just been trapped, decide that they should likely exit the cave to evaluate what just happened. And it's on their way out of the cave that these miners realize that there was collapse. And not only a small collapse, but a large collapse caused by a 45-story tall piece of diorite rock, blocking the only way in and out of the cave. This piece of diorite was almost 1 million tons and fell directly onto the mine shaft. Fortunately, leaving the mine wasn't the only option for these miners, as near the very bottom of the mine was a man-made room known as the refuge. And after realizing that they weren't leaving this mine, all of the miners gathered up and made their way to the refuge. The refuge is exactly how it sounds. It's an emergency shelter area. Fresh air is strategically pumped into this room from the surface and is also stocked with emergency food and medicine. This room was meant for this exact situation, and in this case is going to be the difference between life and death. Because the mine is so massive, men working near the very bottom of the cave still at this point were completely unaware of what happened, and one of the miners had to go down to inform them what had happened and bring them back up to the refuge. These 33 miners weren't just all mining together. They were all in different parts of the cave when this happened. However, they all survived the collapse, and it didn't take long for them to all be gathered up in the safest place in the cave. Some of the miners remembered that the ventilation system that pumps fresh air into different parts of the cave is, by regulation, supposed to be large enough to carry a person, and also should have a ladder inside for situations like this. Unfortunately, after further inspection, it was discovered that these ladders were never installed, and that these air pipes were simply useless for escape. And in their opinion, they have no way of contacting the surface, and at that point, things look grim. During this collapse, there was actually one miner who was in a part of the cave that was above where the collapse was, meaning that he was able to escape. Making his way through ash and rubble, he was able to tell the site supervisors exactly what happened and begin what would end up being a multi-month-long rescue mission. Due to the remote nature of this cave and the lack of any cell service, it took over 5 hours from the collapse happening for any authorities to even be notified of the situation. Unlike the last one, the government was willing to help these people, and they sent a specialized team down the mine shaft to see exactly what was going on. The specialized team decided to take the ventilation shafts down into the mine because they are able to rappel down and do not require a ladder. Although roughly halfway down this ventilation shaft, it is made very obvious that these ventilation shafts were unstable due to the collapse and that they would not be a method of rescue. And on their way back up, some rescuers were almost lost in another smaller collapse that took place within one of the ventilation shafts. And those on the surface still don't even know if the people in the cave are alive or not. After the miners return to the refuge with grim news about the ventilation shaft, the group of miners begin to plan for the worst. And it's at that point when they begin rationing the very small amount of supplies they have, and also begin to set out a routine, as these experienced miners understand that this rescue, if at all possible, will not take days, but likely weeks or longer. While it may seem like these miners are creating their own little community underground, kind of like a fallout shelter, an entirely new city is popping up on the surface of this mine, consisting of concerned citizens, volunteers, and most importantly, family members of those stuck in the mine. After days being stuck in this mine, the miners are unsure if anybody is ever going to come save them, until a noise is heard. A faint drilling noise from above, and they realize that help is on the way, and that somebody is drilling into the mountain. The team drilling above correctly assume that the surviving miners are going to be residing in the refuge, and it's for that reason that they aim a drill from the surface directly to the refuge, and a new challenge appears, accurately setting up the drill to ensure that it reaches the refuge, because even being a percentage of a percent off on the surface, by the time they reach the depth of the refuge could be multiple feet off, meaning that they need to completely reset and re-drill once again. To ensure that this rescue mission goes as smoothly as possible, the Chilean government not only acquires the support of other larger mine rescue teams, but also contacts NASA for consultation to ensure that they are taking the best possible course of action, while a team of experts is ensuring that the drill is put in the perfect position Another group of rescuers try accessing the ventilation shafts once again to ensure that they are completely impossible to save the miners. And unfortunately, it's confirmed. And not only did they confirm that the ventilation shafts are useless, they also confirmed that the diorite rock is still moving. Meaning that not only was there a large cavern that the diorite rock fell from, creating a ton of unstable ground in the cavity that it left, but it also means that this large rock that is now blocking the path is also still unstable and moving, while only slightly. Unfortunately, the drilling isn't going much better, and at this point, the drill has bent and broken multiple times, and the rescue holes that they've started have been abandoned twice, and due to the discovery of the diorite rock moving, the primary entrance of the cave has been closed and sealed forever, now meaning that the only way of saving these miners is by successfully digging a 2,000-foot hole that spans from the surface perfectly into the refuge without collapsing. At this point in the story, we are 14 days into these 33 men being trapped underground, and we are still only just getting started. The head of this rescue mission made an executive decision. They are not going to drill faster, but they're going to drill slower. They begin re-drilling, but turn the drill to half speed to ensure that the drill does not malfunction or break course, as accuracy in this situation is paramount. It's already been proven that trying to rush this drilling would only take longer due to all the possible and likely failures. And it's at this point when things get crazy. 17 days since the collapse, the slow drilling procedure has been semi-successful, and while the drill breaks through into something, they don't know what they had broken through to. And as they remove the drill to insert a camera to inspect where the drill ended up, they noticed that the drill had something attached to it. There was a note attached to it. A note from the miners below. They had contacted them, and to those above, this was the first confirmation that there was any living miners stuck in this cave. The letter described exactly where the drill had broken through in the mine, and also was a personal letter to members of the family from the miners, as they were still completely unsure if their fate was sealed or not. The last thing written on the note is the most important of all. It is a simple confirmation that all 33 miners are alive and well, and this brings the morale of all rescuers to an all-time high. But the job is still not over yet. Like, just think about it. Imagine 17 days ago, over 2 weeks ago, you are told that your family is dead in a mine and that your father, brother, uncle, cousin was in a gold mine that collapsed and that they are dead. And if the collapse didn't kill them, then being underground for 17 days definitely did. But then all of a sudden getting confirmation that not only your loved one, but everybody's loved one is alive in this mine. That has got to be the most intense roller coaster of emotions. Now that they have a hole that goes directly to the refuge, they drill 2 more. One for supplies and one that is intended to be used for rescue. The miners underground now have communication to the surface through a phone that was dropped down one of the supply holes. They have food, medicine, and water provided to them through one of these holes. And while things look amazing, they are still trapped underground. From day 17 till day 65, drilling continues to make a large enough hole to take people out of the refuge, and development continues on a pod that will be sent down this hole and retrieve these people. Essentially an elevator-like tube that can take one person at a time in and out of the cave. And on day 65, both of these new tools are put into place. There is a hole that is wide enough to take people in and out of the refuge, and an experimental device created by the Chilean Navy with support from NASA is ready to be tested. It's a metal tube that can be dropped and retrieved out of the cave, and it's now officially going to begin its first test run. A rescuer bravely enters this pod and descends down into the mine. Unsure if this pod will even make it down to the bottom of the mine safely, or even if it does make it safely, if it's able to go back up. However, a rescuer is required to descend with the pod to give proper instructions on how to safely use it and to give some support to those who have been underground at this point for 65 days. The first miner, who is already pre-selected by the group, enters the pod and makes his 15-minute journey up through the pod, and without a hitch, makes it to the surface successfully and safely. The first of these 33 miners to see the surface for over 2 months. Throughout the night, all 33 of these men were taken to the surface safely, where thousands of people stood by for the rescue and millions of people were watching worldwide on TV as this rescue was broadcasted globally. All of these men were deemed in good physical condition, and they were all instructed to wear sunglasses because they had been in essentially darkness for 2 months, and the sunlight could be harsh on their eyes. All of the men visited the hospital to ensure their vitals, and only 2 of them weren't instantly released. The 2 that weren't instantly released required either dental or some psychological help, both of which had those addressed successfully as well. This entire rescue mission was insane, and the fact that these men were able to survive for so long proves their mental and physical resilience. And I could not imagine the feeling of finally reaching the surface after over 2 months underground to see so many people screaming and cheering and celebrating the success of your rescue. This entire rescue mission cost over $20 million, with the majority of that money coming from private donations. The story, once again, is such a heartwarming example of communities and people coming together to save those in need. And And I really wanted to highlight that element specifically in this video, because a lot of videos on these topics don't do that. They focus on the negative, which I get. And I guess if you want your little bit of negativity, here's something that'll piss you off. Investigations that took place after the rescuers were saved determined that there was no criminal charges responsible to the mining company for this collapse that happened, even though it was known for its unsafe conditions. And while that's an entirely different story for a different video, it's something to ponder on. Many of these men were giving donations and gifts from wealthy people who sympathized with their situation, but these gifts did not allow them to retire, and these men had to make a living, most of them returning to mining, believe it or not. And I knew I had to add it on this list of crazy and insane rescue missions. And I think it goes to show, with enough media attention to get enough people and the right people involved, almost anything is possible. The craziest prison escapes from around the world. The year is 2030, and you and the love of your life are looking out of the window of a luxury helicopter at the beautiful landscape of southern France. Doesn't that just sound like the best vacation ever and a dream come true? Now imagine this. Swap luxury helicopter for old hijacked helicopter, swap the love of your life for one of your co-conspirators, and swap helicopter tour with prison escape. And while you're still in the south of France, you're in a much different situation. And this situation is one of the craziest French prison escapes ever. Our story begins on July 7th, 1963, when our protagonist Pascal Payet was born. And while Pascal had a relatively normal childhood in the south of France, it wasn't long before he started his criminal career and lived a life that was anything but normal. In 1988, at the ripe age of 25, Pascal was convicted of his first crime, aggravated assault. And only 5 years later, in 1993, he was once again convicted of conspiracy. But it wasn't until 4 years after that, on November 20th, 1997, when Pascal's story truly began. Pascal and a group of other French criminals planned and executed an attack on an armored vehicle for the Bank of France. The robbery of this armored vehicle was anything but smooth, and during the robbery, one of the guards of this vehicle was killed, turning a robbery case into a murder case and beyond. Pascal and his associates were able to leave the scene of the crime successfully that day, but they weren't free for long, because in 1999, Pascal, along with his associate Eric Alborio, were found and arrested in Paris. I want to emphasize, all of this is horrible, and he definitely deserves to be in jail, but it's crazy that already this guy is literally living like it's GTA France. But if you think the actions that got Pascal into jail were GTA-esque, just wait until I tell you how he got out of jail. It is January 1999, and Pascal has just arrived in Lithuania. He sees a structure begin to appear outside of the prison bus window. This is a maximum security French prison, and it has existed for over 2 centuries, seeing over the years the craziest list of almost any criminal you could imagine. The history of this place alone is insane, and with centuries to refine their techniques, they were no amateurs when it came to holding and punishing criminals. This prison was built and rebuilt numerous times throughout the last 2 centuries, and its most recent iteration was regarded as one of the most technologically advanced prisons in all of France, and it was considered escape-proof. And if you watched our first video about prison escapes, then you know that escape-proof prisons are not a title, they're a challenge. And to Pascal, that challenge seemed enticing. As Pascal has walked into his cell and sat on his bed, the guards uncuff his ankles and wrists, slam the door behind them, and Pascal is now officially in his new, all-expenses-paid home in the south of France. And the timer has officially begun. To the French government, the timer is counting down the amount of days that Pascal has left to serve. However, in Pascal's brain, a different timer has begun. The timer to plan an escape. And while Pascal had 30 years to sit and think about his plan, it only took him 2 years to theorize and execute his grand escape. Or escapes, I should say. It is October 12th, 2001, and it has been 2 years since Pascal has been behind bars. And over this time, he has been coordinating strategically with one man on the outside, a man named Frederick Impoko. And together, they put together a plan to quickly and easily take Pascal out of this prison. And today was the day they executed the plan. The plan began with Impoko hijacking a helicopter and flying it over top of the prison. The helicopter then quickly landed in a designated part of the courtyard where Pascal would enter the helicopter and the two would fly away into freedom. Although the plan didn't go that smoothly, because although they both got away successfully out of the jail, only 6 days later, Impoko was detained and taken in for questioning. But while Impoko was now behind bars, Pascal was a free man once again. But unfortunately, he still needed to make a living now that he was on the outside. And he dove right back into the only career he knew, stealing. And for 2 years, while on the run, Pascal would rob small-time jewelry stores and live off the profits from his heists. But after those 2 years, he must have began to get lonely, or maybe he felt bad for leaving his associates behind. Because on April 14th, 2003, Eventually, Pascal decided that being free alone wasn't good enough, and he wanted to free some of his friends as well. And that is exactly what he did. Pascal once again organized a helicopter escape from the exact same prison that he escaped from 2 years earlier. This time, he was already free, and he was now freeing 3 other men. The same men that were involved in the bank truck heist in 1997. And once again, a helicopter was hijacked, flown over top of the prison, quickly landing to pick up the criminals, and then flying off into the sunset. But once again, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, because this time, it wasn't just one of the men that were caught. 3 weeks after this second helicopter prison escape, all of the men were caught. There's absolutely no question that Pascal is a bad man, but he's definitely a good friend to his fellow criminals, proving that maybe there is honor among thieves after all. Interestingly, while imprisoned, once again, Pascal decided to take another approach, and instead of planning another escape, he decided to write a blog post. A blog post specifically about the mistreatment he was experiencing in the French prison system. He complained that the conditions he was experiencing was poor, and he was also complaining of being transferred so many times, specifically being transferred 9 times in 30 months. And in combination with this letter, he also went on a hunger strike in one of these prisons because he didn't want to be moved again. These attempts were unsuccessful, but they, happened. At this point, Pascal is behind bars for good, right? He was able to coordinate 2 separate helicopter escapes, and at this point, he is now serving so much time behind bars. Like, seriously, after all of the dust had settled, Pascal was facing 30 years for the murder that happened on the truck in 1997, 6 years for the jailbreak that happened in 2001, 7 years for busting his friends out in 2003, and now he's resorted to writing blog posts and not eating. So now he's not only mentally given up, but also physically frail. There's no way that he's, going to have any other escapes, right? And the answer is, of course not. By the time that July 2007 rolled around, Pascal was one of the most closely monitored prisoners in all of France, and for good reason. And what that looked like was consistent surveillance by guards and also being placed permanently in solitary confinement. In combination with both of those measures, Pascal was also moved every 6 months to new prisons so that he couldn't formulate a plan for too long, which also ironically increased his transfer frequency, something he was trying to get reduced with his hunger strike and letter. Regardless, even with all of these measures in place, Pascal still had a bit more fight in him. And on July 14th, 2007, on Bastille Day, a national holiday in France, Pascal made his final escape. If you're unfamiliar with Bastille Day, imagine the 4th of July, but in France. Fireworks, food, friends, family, just a lot of festive things. And while many see this as an opportunity to relax, Pascal saw this as an opportunity to get to work. And work he did. Because while all of the festivities were happening outside and law enforcement were already busy enough with all of the festivities happening, 4 men in ski masks were quickly approaching a French airport to once again hijack a helicopter. These men were successful. They kidnapped a pilot, hijacked the helicopter, and forced this pilot to fly over the prison that Pascal was currently in. The helicopter once again landed in the prison. The men went into the prison and freed Pascal from his solitary confinement, and in only 5 minutes after arriving, the helicopter was flying out of the jail. The criminals forced the pilot to fly 40 kilometers northeast to a location on the Mediterranean coast, where they had the pilot land the helicopter, and the pilot and the helicopter were free. And unfortunately, so was Pascal Payet. 2 days after this escape took place, a Europe-wide arrest warrant was placed against Pascal Payet, and even still, it took over 2 months for Pascal to be caught. However, on September 21st, 2007, in a suburb of Barcelona, Spain, Pascal was caught and once again put into French custody, where he remains to this very day. This story is almost picture perfect and kinda has everything you want. A beautiful European landscape, helicopters, crime, suspense, helicopters, friendship. It's really got it all, and I knew for that reason I had to make it the first entry on this list. Because seriously, how do you have 3 consecutive prison escapes all involving hijacked helicopters? Like, if nothing else, you've got to admit that this guy is consistent. Pascal found his method and just worked it till he couldn't anymore. What I find crazy is now, after the 3rd successful helicopter escape, the police have decided that they're going to make the location of Pascal private for security reasons, obviously to avoid a 4th helicopter escape, which I think is logical and possibly a bit, late, but I guess still worth doing. But yeah, it's just crazy to think that there's a good chance that Pascal could have been a free man after his first successful helicopter escape. At the time, he was behind bars and facing 30 years for murder that took place in 1997, but decided that even though he was free, he wanted to go back and help his 3 friends escape as well, which is something I really wish I knew the motivation behind, but I guess that is kind of up to speculation. He could have freed his friends because, he wanted his friends to have the same freedom as him, or maybe because he was, as a free man, still still living a life of crime. He wanted his crime friends back so he could, have more people to commit crime with. It's really up in the air on his motivation, but regardless, he did it. And now, as of today, his laundry list of charges goes as follows: 30 years for the murder, 6 years for jailbreak 1, 7 years for jailbreak 2, 5 years for jailbreak 3, and on top of all of these, an additional 15 years for all of the robberies that took place while he was a free man. At that point, he would have been better off just serving his initial 30 years. But I guess the moral of the story here is crime never pays. Now, what do you get when you mix two charming, intelligent, cold-blooded killers, a lonely and vulnerable prison employee, and paper-thin prison walls? Well, you'd be getting our next story. Richard Ricky Matt was born on June 25th, 1966, and grew up in foster care in Buffalo, New York. His childhood was anything but desirable. Throughout the course of his adult life, he had served multiple prison sentences that were shorter term. But once he was free again after serving his time, he decided that his best course of action was to get a job and then 2 weeks after working there, rob, kidnap, and murder his boss. And after this murder, he fled to Mexico, where he, a year later, robbed and killed another man. For this second murder, he received a 23-year sentence. But in 2007, Richard was extradited back to the United States, where he received a 25 to life sentence for his first murder, the murder of William Rickerson, the man who tried to give his convict a career and an opportunity, only to be robbed, kidnapped, and murdered and dismembered by the man he was only trying to help. Regardless, Richard was convicted of second-degree murder and was sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. David Paul Sweat was born on June 14th, 1980, in Binghamton, New York State. He was raised by a single mother and grew up with 2 sisters, and from a child, he was a troubled individual. Even as young as 9, David was demonstrating extremely violent tendencies, and for that reason, his mom sent him to Florida to live with his uncle, which resulted in David stealing and wrecking his aunt's car, and his aunt and uncle then sending him into foster care. During his late teens, Sweat was essentially homeless, living off of any money he could make selling weed. It was during this time that he began planning elaborate burglaries. And throughout his late teens in the 1990s, Sweat was arrested and sent to prison multiple times, where he served his sentences. But on the 4th of July in 2002, Sweat, his cousin, and a third accomplice decided that they would cash in on the profits of 4th of July and robbed a fireworks store in Pennsylvania. Not to steal fireworks, however, but to steal guns. These 3 men were successfully able to steal the firearms. And that night, after the robbery, drove from Pennsylvania back to New York State, where they planned on splitting up the loot. The 3 men pulled into a dimly lit parking lot where the others' cars were parked, and they began to divide up the loot. But while transferring guns from one of the cars to the other, a police officer spotted what was going on and decided to investigate. As the police officer began to approach the man, Sweat opened fire on the police officer, but didn't kill him. That was until Sweat decided to run over this police officer with his vehicle and then drive away. After Sweat was gone, Sweat's cousin decided to then shoot the police officer in the head again. The men all left the parking lot, but fortunately, only a few days later, all 3 men were caught. Sweat pled guilty to avoid the death sentence and was convicted of first-degree murder, and he was too sent to the Clinton Correctional Facility. I'm sure you're already seeing a bit of similarities and differences between these 2 horrible people. Richard and David both spent time in foster care, both had violent tendencies, and both had numerous run-ins in the law and spent time in prison before the time they ever even met, which leads us to when they did meet, which obviously took place within the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York State. And unfortunately, these 2 didn't only serve time together, but formed a rather twisted friendship, and shortly after bonding, began planning their escape from prison. At the beginning of this story, I did mention that these men were intelligent and charming, and unfortunately, that is the case for most psychopaths, something that obviously both of these men were. They had no empathy, no remorse, and no issue killing innocent people for their own gain. But another key component of psychopaths are their tendency to manipulate people, and that tendency to manipulate was a huge factor in the eventual escape of Richard and David. And that escape in question is kind of a blend of the very real Alcatraz escape that I actually talked about in the first prison escape video and the fictional Shawshank Redemption prison escape. Early on in their plans to escape, they both knew that if they wanted to escape, they were going to need some serious help. And because of this, the first step in their plan involved manipulating somebody on the inside to begin helping them. And that person on the inside was Joyce Mitchell. Mitchell was an older woman working as a supervisor in the Taylor department of the prison. And for reasons unknown to us, Richard and David decided that she was the perfect person to convert to their side. And how they went about doing this was extremely upsetting because they used not aggression or fear, but love. Both of these men individually began to develop intimate relationships with Joyce Mitchell within the prison. And over time, were able to get her to begin helping them by providing supplies, specifically by getting tools out of the prison workshop, hiding them in burger meat, and delivering them to these two criminals. Now, I don't want to make Joyce Mitchell kind of sound like the innocent victim in this story, because it did come out that there was a plan that David and Richard would kill Joyce's husband. But yeah, don't think of her as some victim. She was complicit in this. But just imagine the sheer riz of these two men. Like, Mitchell has a husband, a job, and somehow she was able to be manipulated and convinced by two criminals that the best course of action of her was to aid these criminals in their escape, and once these criminals escape, they can kill her husband and then all go to Mexico together. Like, that is crazy level manipulation. Once Richard and David had Mitchell on their side, their plan was in full effect. And from that point, it only took 6 months for that plan to be executed. Over these 6 months, Mitchell would slowly bring different tools and components into the jail cells of each of these men, and possibly do other things as well. Regardless, once these men had the tools, they were able to begin chipping away at their very own cell walls. Similar to the Alcatraz escapes, both of these men developed holes in their cells under the sink where they could slip into the endless labyrinth of tunnels existing within the prison. The men were quickly able to access the tunnel system behind the walls. However, it took most of that 6 months to develop a plan on exactly where to go in the tunnel system, and also to cut holes into huge steam pipes that they would eventually climb through for their escape. There's actually an investigation video showing two investigators going from the prison cell to the manhole cover, showing exactly how long and tight and uncomfortable this entire journey is. And it took the investigators only 20 minutes to get through all of it. This includes going down 6 stories via catwalks and pipes, and then traveling across the pipeline, going through small holes in the wall between blocks, until they eventually get to a huge steam pipe that they likely took months to cut a hole into. And how they would do this is literally every night, making this entire journey to make slight holes in the pipe until they could finally cut the whole chunk of metal out of the pipe. And then eventually, once they could go into this pipe, they were able to climb through it, enter the final room that led them to essentially a sewer under the road, roughly 150 meters outside of the prison, where they could climb a ladder, raise the manhole cover, and be free. But the story doesn't end there, because even though Mitchell, up until this point, only brought the men tools, she also was supposed to be the getaway driver. But on the night of the escape, Mitchell had a panic attack, thought she was having a heart attack, and went to the hospital. So a different prison employee actually ended up being their getaway driver. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves. On June 5th, 2015, at 10:30 p.m., both Matt and David were accounted for in the nightly head count at the prison. However, the next morning on June 5th at 5:50 a.m., during morning count, they were unaccounted for, and the search began. It only took a few hours for the prison to notice the external breach. They had only 150 meters outside of the prison wall. It was the obviously open manhole cover that had led directly to the basement of the prison. Due to this discovery, it didn't take long for investigators to find out exactly how Richard and David escaped. Interestingly, when the investigators were looking through the tunnel system that they used to escape, they found an interesting note. It was simply a piece of paper that said, "Have a nice day," and drawn below that was a racist Asian smiley face with a triangular rice hat, which is just odd. But now the men were free, but their plans were still not completed. The original plan was to murder Mitchell's husband and then flee to Mexico. But with Mitchell in the hospital and them having a completely different getaway driver, they decided their best bet was to go to Canada. But they couldn't just go straight there, and they had to take their time. And during that time, roughly 3 weeks, there was an extensive manhunt that was established by both the American and Canadian governments to make sure that these two men did not escape. 20 days after the initial escape, one of the two men was spotted for the first time. Richard Matt was spotted in Franklin County, New York. He was spotted because he was shooting at traffic with a 20-gauge shotgun taken from a hunting camp. Obviously, when you shoot at pedestrians, the police are going to get involved. And shortly after, Matt was shooting at civilians. The police shot and killed Richard. But that's only Richard. At the time of Richard's death, David's location was still unknown, and the investigation was still well underway. And I can only assume for law enforcement that finding David was a lot more personal, as David was somebody who did kill a police officer. However, only 2 days after Richard was shot by police officers, David was spotted just jogging on the side of the road. The police officer that spotted him went to question him, where David began to run through a field and into a wooded area. The police officer quickly drew his pistol and shot David. However, David did not die. Interestingly, both of these two men were found only 2 kilometers from the Canadian-US border, meaning that if they weren't found when they did, they would have likely made it into Canada and possibly escaped conviction or death altogether. Or at the very least, they would have extended their freedom by quite a bit. After everything was said and done, Richard Matt was killed. Sweat pled guilty to an additional 2 counts of felony, first-degree escape, and an additional count of promoting prison contraband, which gave him an additional 7 years, which was served consecutively with his previous life sentence. Joyce Joyce Mitchell pled guilty and received 7 years in prison and a $6,300 fine, as well as $80,000 in restitution. And as of February 2020, she was actually released and is now on parole. And Gene Palmer, the backup driver and the other prison official who aided in the escape of these two killers, was sentenced to 6 months in jail and fined $5,300. So yeah, if you haven't learned anything in this video so far, I think one important takeaway is that if you ever do plan on escaping prison, two good ways of going about it are having a helicopter or just extreme riz. And at this point, I can't even imagine the possibilities of a man with extreme riz and a helicopter. Jokes aside, let's just move on to the next and final entry on this list. And I say this list because if you guys like this concept, feel free to leave a like or a comment below letting me know you like prison escape videos. I'd be more than happy to make more of them in the future. Your support always means a lot. Let's move on. Alfred George Hines was born in 1917, and at the young age of only 7 years old, his father died when he was caught for an armed robbery and was served corporal punishment that actually ended up killing him. He was sentenced to 10 lashes from the Cat 06, which is just a crazy whip, and this entire process killed him. And because of this, Hines decided to run away from home at the age of 7. Hines briefly stayed at an orphanage before he escaped and began living on his own and surviving off of petty theft, which later landed him in a juvenile detention center, which he, at that point, once again, escaped from. Hines' upbringing was troubled to say the least, and when he turned 21, he was drafted into the Second World War, something he didn't actually do because he deserted the armed forces and went back to his full-time career of crime, which resulted in a jewelry heist that happened in 1953. This heist performed by Hines was in the multiple six-figure range, and $90,000 of that was never found ever. But shortly after this jewel heist, Hines was caught and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But like everybody else we've discussed on this list so far, Hines had no plans of staying in jail for his entire sentence. Only a few weeks into his stay in prison, Hines realized that at night, the guards were severely outnumbered, and there was really only 2 night guards per 1,000 inmates, which meant that Hines had a lot of time to work on his craft, and his craft in this case was metalworking. And what he was able to do was fashion a scrap piece of metal into a makeshift key to release himself from his cell without ever being detected. But picking the lock in his cell wasn't the only challenge he faced on this escape, because after he was out of his cell and out of the prison itself, he still had to climb a 20-foot wall. A feat so impressive that the media instantly gave him the name Houdini Hines because of his escape. Just keep in mind, for the guards, they were doing their nightly routine when they were walking by and they saw Hines, and then maybe an hour or 2 hours later when they would walk by again, Hines' cell was empty, there was no signs of any damage, and there was absolutely nothing changed besides the fact that Hines wasn't there. If they didn't know any better, Hines could have just disappeared into thin air. Although, that obviously wasn't the case. And after his escape, Hines spent 248 days as a free man working odd jobs until he was arrested again in 1956. And it was at this point when he was sent back to prison. But Hines knew that because he was going back to prison, he was going to be made an example of, because his initial escape made national headlines. And this obviously embarrassed the prison system and the government. So now that they had him back in their claws, they weren't going to let him go. And because of this, Hines had to think fast. And what Hines decided to do was, as he was being sent to prison for the second time, he decided to sue the prison system for misconduct. And even as a criminal, he had the right to a trial. And it was at this trial where he was able to execute his second escape. While in the courtroom, he asked the judge if he could use the washroom for just a moment. The judge agreed, and 2 guards brought Hines directly to the washroom, where they unshackled his hands and feet and allowed him to use the facility. But as soon as Hines was unshackled, he pushed both of the guards into the bathroom and locked it with a padlock that was left in the hallway by a co-conspirator. And the only reason he was able to even lock this door at all was because the day before the trial, a co-conspirator of Hines installed screw eyes on the stall door so that he could actually apply the padlock and lock these 2 in the washroom. After Hines' hands and feet were free and the guards were locked in the bathroom, he instantly made a run for it, and for the next 5 hours escaped directly to the airport where he was waiting for the next flight out of England. But before he could catch any flight, he was caught and brought back to prison for a 3rd time. Within a year of being brought back to prison for the 3rd time, he made his 3rd and final escape. The escape itself was nothing to write home about, although it did go to show the sheer perseverance and dedication that Hines had to not being in prison. But after being caught for a final time and brought back to jail, he decided that escaping wasn't the way to go. And from that point on, he decided to consistently get into legal disputes with the prison system to try to prove his innocence or to get his jail time appealed. He was basically spending all of his time in jail using the legal system against itself to try to get out of jail ASAP. And while he wasn't successful at it, and he did serve the rest of his time in prison, he was able to win a few £1,000s from random settlements that he was pursuing. Hines Hines also falls into the category of orphan slash foster care child turned prison escapee, which is interesting. That's definitely not something I intended to do in this video, but it is an interesting consistency I've noticed throughout most of these prison escapes. And I think the fact that Hines was able to escape prison 3 times definitely earned him the nickname Houdini Hines. But once again, we find ourselves in a situation where Hines would have been better off just serving the initial 12 years than escaping and then serving the rest of his time. Sure, he had more breaks in between, but living as an active fugitive is definitely not a life that I would want to live. I couldn't imagine having to look over your shoulder every day just to try to live a normal life. But I know I said that this was the last story in the video, but I actually have a quick bonus one, so let's get into it. Yoga is really relaxing and has a lot of health benefits. But one of the benefits that most people don't talk about when they speak of yoga is escaping prison. But for Korean thief Choi Gap-bok, being an expert in yoga for over 23 years was the deciding factor between being in jail and being a free man. Let me explain. On September 12th, 2012, Choi Gap-bok was arrested in association with a mysterious theft. It was assumed that he was the leader of a theft ring, and for that reason, the police wanted to hold him until they could gather more evidence on him in the entire situation. And on that day, Choi was placed in a cell. And while his stay was at that point undetermined, Choi was personally determined to make that stay as short as possible. And how he did so was extremely interesting, because during Choi's time in this jail cell, he realized that at the bottom of the jail cell door, there was a hole. And this hole was useful for him because every day this is how the guards would feed him. But he quickly began to ponder if this was a hole he could fit through. The hole was only 15 centimeters tall and 45 centimeters wide. Not large at all, but Choi wasn't really a large man either. Choi was only 5'4" and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Even still, this hole was put in these doors for food, not people. One night, after being fed dinner, Choi asked one of the guards if he could have some skin ointment. He felt a rash coming on and he wanted to subdue it early. And luckily, the guards obliged. They handed him a skin ointment and then went back to their post. And late into that night, Choi waited until the 3 guards that were monitoring his cell fell asleep, which is when Choi began to execute his master plan. Choi applied this skin ointment all across his body to essentially lube up and slide through the crack on the bottom of the door. After applying the ointment to his skin, specifically his upper body and head, he was able to escape his cell in only 34 seconds. And after escaping his cell, he was easily able to sneak out of the jail and be a free man. Hours after Choi had snuck out of the jail and was running as far away as he could from the jail itself, the officers woke up and they looked in his cell, and when they tried to wake up Choi, they realized that Choi was in his bed. There was a decoy in the place he should have been, but there was no evidence of an escape until they checked the CCTV footage and realized exactly how he escaped. Interestingly, Choi, who was in a cell for 5 days, had the wherewithal to put a decoy in his bed when the previous 2 criminals we just talked about were planning for 6 months and still couldn't drum up a decoy in any of that time. Just an interesting observation. But what else is interesting is that even though Choi was able to make nearly an impossible escape and use his flexibility and lubrication skills to escape a jail cell, he was not able to remain free for long, because 6 days after his escape, he was recaptured and put into a cell with a much smaller food slot. This one was a lot shorter, but I kind of wanted to add it as a bonus because I just thought it was funny. Some lube and yoga can get you out of a lot of tough situations. Forbidden places you will never visit. Just imagine you're on a fishing boat in the Bay of Bengal. You've had a successful day and it's time to get back to shore, when all of a sudden a typhoon forms right in front of your face over the water. And before you know it, your boat has been flipped and you are essentially lost at sea. Your entire crew is gone and you're holding onto a floating board for dear life. Your energy is low from kicking and screaming, and you pass out, clinging to this board. You wake up later, looking at a clear sky, and you notice you're not in the water anymore. You're on the beach, but you don't know what beach you're at because you weren't near land. You cough up some water and start to sit up when you realize a small bunch of blobs in the distance. You see them approach and you realize that it's people, but not people you've seen before. The closer you get, the more you realize that these people are barely clothed and wielding sticks and bows. Did you time travel? Unfortunately not. You have just washed up on North Sentinel Island. North Sentinel Island is the first location on this list, and it is likely one of the most well-known forbidden places in the entire world. Oh, and as far as the fisherman who washed up on the beach, yeah, his skull is now a pendant for one of the Sentinelese people. North Sentinel Island is one of the Andaman Islands in the Indian archipelago in the Bay of Bengal, which also includes some other smaller islands as well. What makes North Sentinel Island so unique is the fact that it's solely occupied by a voluntarily isolated indigenous tribe, who are believed to have been there for over 60,000 years. These people are known as the Sentinelese, and they have made their wishes known by force, specifically by killing anybody who tries to contact them, or even come close. They have made their message so clear that the Indian Navy patrols the area around the North Sentinel Island to protect it from people trying to enter it. And the Indian government does not prosecute any Sentinelese people for killing people that try to step ashore. That's insane that this uncontacted tribe is essentially immune to the law. The Sentinelese have not only attacked people that have stepped on shore, but have also repeatedly attacked approaching vessels, whether those be fishing boats or simply any sort of low-flying helicopter or plane in the range of their bows and arrows. The story I told at the beginning of this segment is actually inspired by real events that took place in 2006. During this time, Sentinelese islanders killed 2 fishermen whose boat drifted ashore. And like the intro story, this approach wasn't even intentional. Although, speaking of intentionally visiting the Sentinelese, in 2018, a 26-year-old man named John Chu, who was an American Christian missionary, tried on 3 separate attempts to visit the North Sentinelese people, likely to convert them to Christianity, but unfortunately on his 3rd trip, which he was successfully able to approach these people, he was unsurprisingly murdered, which is obviously unfortunate. But this young man was warned by the Indian government and other authorities. In 1956, there was an Islands Protection of Aboriginal Tribes regulation that was put in place that restricted any approach closer than 5 nautical miles, which is essentially anywhere within a 10-kilometer radius of the island. The biggest reason why this regulation was put in place is to protect the Sentinelese people from mainland diseases. Due to the severity of the isolation of North Sentinel Island, they have almost no immunity to any modern-day disease or germ that may be on you or I right now. So if you were to visit North Sentinel Island, there's a very likely chance that even spending time around them, breathing near them, shaking one of their hands, could lead to the death of the entire population of the Sentinelese people simply by spreading germs. North Sentinel Island is a forbidden location that I personally don't intend on breaking any rules to visit. But what if fishing wasn't your speed? Perhaps you are more interested in agriculture, specifically Chinese agriculture. The year is 1974, and you are simply on your farm. And what's a good farm without a well? So, you start digging a well. However, this day was different. As you start digging, you notice something that is about to uncover one of the largest excavation projects of all time. And then you go deeper and you notice hardened fragments of terracotta. And then you notice bronze arrowheads. And then terracotta bricks. Well, in that case, you just discovered the tomb of Qin Shi Huang, the first Qin emperor of China. These artifacts were submitted to the government, and shortly after, archaeologists arrived. And although they were curious and interested about the artifacts that may have laid underground, they were not at all prepared for what they were about to find. What they found was a massive necropolis, the size of a small city, with a plethora of artifacts, weapons, vehicles, and most famously, terracotta soldiers. There is estimated to be over 8,000 terracotta soldiers in total, but that actual figure is unknown because this mausoleum is still not fully excavated and may never be. Keep in mind, this excavation has been going on since 1974 and still continues to this day. This mausoleum was built from 246 to 208 BC. The mausoleum mirrored the city of Jianyang with an inner and outer city structure. And although this outer and inner city structure where the terracotta soldiers have been found has began to be excavated, one place that has never been touched was the tomb itself. This tomb is at the very center of the complex, and it is very large. In case the thousands of terracotta soldiers were not enough of a sign, the late Qin Shi Huang did not want people entering his tomb. At least, not without a fight, I guess. So I suppose that begs the question, why did the government keep excavating? Well, the 3 reasons they listed publicly were the following. One was the fact that this area was a seismic zone, and they needed to remove these historic artifacts to protect them. The next reason was for tourism, to potentially make it something that people could visit and appreciate. And the third reason was to prevent grave robbing, essentially theorizing that if they didn't take it, somebody else would. In case the 8,000 terracotta soldiers didn't make this obvious, this mausoleum is massive. The replica inner city is over 2.5 kilometers in circumference, and the outer city is over 6.3 kilometers in circumference, which is insane for a mausoleum. Even the tomb itself is massive. It's believed to be 80 meters east to west and 50 meters north to south, and 15 meters tall on the inside. However, the interior height is debated. It is a very real possibility that we will never be able to know what's inside the tomb, simply because of limitations in archaeological abilities, specifically the risk of destroying so many other artifacts just to get inside the tomb. But we do have historical accounts of what is said to be inside the tomb, which is the following. The emperor's tomb is surrounded by rivers of liquid mercury, which was the emperor's immortality elixir of choice. Which, just quick side note, Yeah, this emperor was literally drinking mercury to try to extend his life, which ironically ended up causing him to go crazy and die. But okay, back to the historical account. There is a domed ceiling representing celestial bodies made from pearls and precious gems. The floor has a design of the entire map of his empire. And besides all of his precious belongings and stunning architecture, there was of course claims of booby traps, specifically crossbow traps that would be activated if anybody tried to enter the tomb, which would result in them, of course, being shot and killed. Here's where things get interesting. These accounts were of course questionable, and archaeologists were suspicious. But after probing the soil near the tomb, it was confirmed that the mercury levels in the soil were 100 times over the normal level, giving some credibility to these historic claims, which also gives credibility to the fact that there may be booby traps, which has essentially spooked archaeologists, as they believe these traps would be fully functioning, which I personally find hard to believe, but I also wouldn't risk it either. This tomb is listed as a World Heritage Site and is therefore protected by legal entities. But that's not the only reason why you're not able to go here. Unlike North Sentinel Island, which is relatively easy to visit if you have a boat or know somebody with a boat, the tomb of Qin Shi Huang is simply unable to be reached, at least to any regular person with reasonable means. What I mean is, of course, if you hypothetically had a bunch of dynamite, you could blow it up, but obviously that's not realistic. Or is it? No. Unless... Just kidding. Therefore, you're not only not allowed to visit it, you're also not able, making it a perfect entry for this list. Let's hope that you got your sea legs back, because we're hitting the water again. This time, we're going to a remote island intentionally, although it's not off the coast of India. This island is actually in the Arctic Circle. This island is known as Spitsbergen, and it's tucked away in the Arctic Svalbard archipelago. And if you're wondering why we're going here, it's primarily because of your passion for agriculture. Spitsbergen is the home of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, and this seed vault is one of the most interesting places in the entire world, and is kind of an interesting take on the Doomsday Vault. In short, it's an ultra-secure facility with the sole purpose of being a safeguard for global crop diversity by storing duplicates of every known seed. This place is really just a sperm bank for plants, or other stuff like that. The Seed Vault is actually a partnership between the Norwegian government and Crop Trust, which is a genetic resource center, which sounds evil, but probably isn't. But it might be. This facility is epic, and if you like brutalist architecture, you are going to love this building. It's essentially a concrete slab sticking out the side of a mountain in the middle of an uninhabited Arctic wasteland. To me, it seems like a pretty cool place to store some stuff. The entire facility goes almost 400 feet into the side of a mountain, and a majority of this facility is kept at negative 18 degrees Celsius, as that is the recommended temperature to store seeds. I guess, I don't know, I'm not a seed expert. One unique failsafe about this facility that I think is pretty cool is the fact that even if all the refrigeration units failed today, the seed vault would still be completely protected because it is stored within permafrost, meaning that it's very well insulated and very cold. Now, if only the people that designed this designed the Death Star too. As of 2022, there is over 1.2 million unique types of seed in this facility. And interestingly, and potentially somewhat obviously, this facility is not manned. It is autonomous, and I suppose that's a good thing considering the fact that it's literally in the middle of nowhere, always kept at deadly temperatures with basically nothing around you. This seed bank is a really unique modern invention that I think serves a genuine purpose that hopefully we will never need, but could very well serve a massive role in the development of humanity if it ever came to it. I think it goes without saying that this seed vault is completely off limits. Not only is it in an extremely remote location in a part of the world that's already hard to navigate and travel to, but the facility itself is extremely secure. So unfortunately, you won't be able to check out the cool seed collection, but that's okay. And you're a person of culture. Modern archives and architecture is cool, but you want history. You want to see some cool stuff and some old stuff. And for that exact reason, we're going to France. The date is September 12th, 1940, and you and your trusty dog are on a walk like any other day. Your dog notices a hole left by an uprooted tree, and you notice something rather interesting, but you don't bother at the moment. You go home and ponder on what you may have saw and decide that you have some unfinished business, and you return to that uprooted tree with 3 of your best friends. You begin digging, a common theme in this video I suppose, and notice that this uprooted tree has a lot below it. specifically a 15-meter deep cave shaft. You and your friends are brave, and you enter the cave and start exploring. And not only do you see some cool stalactites and stalagmites and light brights, but you also see interesting designs on the walls. Those designs were ancient cave paintings depicting animals. This cave is known as Lascaux Cave, and it is a network of caves in southwestern France with over 600 cave paintings found on the interior walls of its caves. It is suggested that these paintings were not made all at once and that they were the combined effort of many generations. And although they haven't been able to quite pinpoint a date for each and every one of these paintings, the general consensus is that these paintings are anywhere from 17 to 22,000 years old, which is so cool. There was an amount of time where this cave was actually open to the public for tours, but over time, due to carbon dioxide, heat, humidity, and other contaminants produced by the 1,200 visitors that visited these caves a day, the paintings were essentially disintegrating and were being visibly damaged. Therefore, the cave was closed to the public in 1963. Since then, the paintings have been restored to their original state and a monitoring system has been put in place. It's actually just a baguette holding a door closed. I don't know, I'm sure they've got something amazing. So yeah, unless you're able to travel at least 70 years into the past, you're not going to be seeing these original 22,000-year-old paintings. However, this story does have a bit of a happy ending, because obviously there was demand for these cave tours, and that wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. So what the authorities actually did was create exact replicas of this cave system for people to explore and visit without any risk of the originals being damaged, which is honestly pretty cool. But what isn't cool is snakes. And since 2 out of the 4 entries on this list so far have been on islands, let's add another one to the list and combine the 2. Snakes in an island. You know what that gets you? You're right. Snake Island. No, not the island boy's haircut. Snake Island is an island, I know. And it is also off the coast of Brazil. The island is famous for, of course, its large population of venomous snakes, specifically the golden lancehead pit viper. And what's interesting is that this island is the only known natural home for this breed of snakes. But there is a bit of mystery surrounding this island. How exactly did these snakes get here, and why is there so many of them? It's not called Snake Island because there's a few. It's called Snake Island because it's only inhabited by snakes, and a lot of them at that. The island is roughly 106 acres in area, and is believed to be the home of around 400,000 snakes, although that number more recently has been debated. But if you ask me, I don't think we're getting an accurate head count anytime soon. Point being, there is a lot of snakes on this island. But the question remains, how did these snakes get here? And I hope you brought your tissues, because it's kind of a sad story. Basically, when the Portuguese colonized Brazil, the Portuguese made all of the native Brazilians disown their pet snakes. Obviously outraged, the native Brazilians didn't give up their snakes without a fight, and they banded up all of their snakes and sent them off to sea on a raft, hoping that they would find a better life. After a few days, this raft of about 500,000 snakes washed up ashore on this uninhabited island, and the rest is history. I totally just made all of that up. The real reason why there is so many snakes on this island is much more simple. During the last ice age, this island, which is now 33 kilometers off the coast of Brazil, was actually connected to the mainland. But near the end of the ice age, as water levels started to rise, the snakes essentially became trapped on this island. Their population grew due to a lack of natural predators. Fortunately, these snakes weren't the only animals on the island. There was actually a plethora of ladders, but unfortunately, after a few dangerous games of snakes and ladders, only the snakes remained. I don't know why I'm lying so much in this video, but hopefully you can tell fact from fiction. Sure, there's a lot of snakes on an island, but there's a lot of snakes on a plane too, and people are still on the plane. Why is there not people on this island? Well, similar to North Sentinel Island, Snake Island is off limits to any civilians. The Brazilian Navy claims that this is for the protection of both the snakes and the people that may potentially try to access the island. The only people that are advised to go on the island have to be vetted by the Institute for Biodiversity Conservation, which I'm assuming is no easy task. And if you try to go the other way, well, you'll have to deal with the Brazilian Navy. And similar to North Sentinel Island, if the snakes kill you, the Brazilian Navy is not going to put them in jail. That's crazy that now twice on this list, there is groups of people that are immune to the law simply because they got an island. I wonder if there's any more recent examples of people with islands breaking the law. That's an interesting phenomenon, but let's keep moving. Wait, okay, last thing I'm gonna say about Snake Island. Making fake maps claiming that there is buried treasure on this remote island, when in reality, it's actually just Snake Island, would be a hilarious prank. Not in the modern day, but definitely pirate times, dude. This was a pirate time banger of a prank, guaranteed. You know what? We're on the topic of islands. Last island, one last island for the list. Palette cleanse, we'll go through it quick. Morgan Island. No story, no nothing. Just straight up facts. Morgan Island is also known as Monkey Island, and if you can't guess why it's called that, you may live on Monkey Island. Monkey Island is famous for, of course, its population of free-ranged monkeys. It is completely uninhabited by people, and this island is protected by the Department of Natural Resources and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which use it for public health research, which unfortunately is basically just animal testing. Boo. Monkey Island, unlike Snake Island, is not naturally occurring, and actually has a very odd origin story. To put it bluntly, there was a lot of monkeys in Puerto Rico that were carrying hepatitis B, and it was becoming so much of a problem that there was frequent outbreaks. So what is the most logical and reasonable next step? Well, according to some people in 1979, the best idea was to capture 1,400 monkeys and relocate them to a remote island in South Carolina. And ladies and gentlemen, Morgan Island, aka Monkey Island. So in case you ever wanted to be surrounded by over 1,000 monkeys with hepatitis, Morgan Island definitely needs to be on your travel wish list. But you don't just want to go to remote islands full of uncontacted tribes or a plethora of dangerous animals, and you don't want to go to rural China. And you don't like the cold, so Norway's out too. Well, if that's the case, then I have one last location for you. And if you're a Reddit meme lord, then you're going to be right at home. This last forbidden location takes us to a salt flat in the middle of Nevada. The salt flat is known as Groom Lake, and what makes this salt flat relevant to this video is what's built on the salt flat. That being a Nevada test and training range. But there's military bases everywhere, so what makes this one so special? This test and training range is home to one of the most popular and highly classified United States Air Force bases, most commonly known as Area 51. Interestingly, Area 51 was never considered a secret base. However, it is the home for some of the most secret and sensitive documents that pertain to military intel in the United States. The origin of the name Area 51 is actually unknown. However, according to the CIA, the proper names for the facility are Homey Airport and Groom Lake. The primary initial purpose of Area 51 was a testing ground for Project Aquatone, the development of the Lockheed U-2, which was one of the most iconic spy planes of all time, and still has a lot of mystery surrounding it, almost 70 years later. Since then, this area has gained a lot more popularity, and due to the secrecy surrounding it, there has been no shortage of questions, mysteries, and conspiracy theories surrounding the happenings of this military base. Obviously, with the most famous examples being its affiliation with aliens. I honestly wish I had more to talk about, but facts about this location are kind of hard to come by, and I don't think I need to explain why a military base with sensitive information is off limits. But I do find it kind of interesting that, although this is a perfect entry for this video, it's a bit of a catch-22. Because for any random civilian, Area 51 is a place you will never even get close to. At least, not alive. But for hundreds of people, this is a place they come every single day. It's their job. But that's a different story. In 2019, there was actually a large movement for people with way too much free time to storm Area 51 to get answers and see an alien for themselves. This movement was heavily meme-based, but was still very real. On the night of the actual event, over 1,500 people showed up at the border of Area 51, primarily partying and enjoying the scenery, although some took it more serious than others. At the end of the event, nobody got in, surprisingly nobody died, and 7 people were arrested. It was a mostly peaceful meme, but I'm sure when all of this was gaining traction and popularity online, some government employees were definitely starting to sweat a bit. You wake up to the sound of a horse-drawn buggy galloping down a cobblestone road. This is a familiar sound. Every morning the coroners come and collect all of the dead and take them to a burn pile. Today's pile is particularly large. You take a deep breath and reluctantly get out of bed. Today is like any other. You skip breakfast and get straight to work because there is no time to spare. You start by getting dressed. You open your closet and are met with your alter ego, the plague doctor, and for many, the last thing they see before death. You begin by putting on long undergarments tucked into each other, long johns tucked into socks, undershirt tucked into pants, anything to keep out the bad air. Next, you put on a thick, ankle-length overcoat, which has been sealed with animal fat and pleasantly scented wax to prevent any air from seeping in. Next, you put on your boots and gloves, making sure they maintain a tight seal. Following that, you put on your bird-like beak mask. Every morning, you empty the beak and refill it. This beak serves a very important purpose. It was believed that the spread of the plague was caused by bad air, particularly bad smells. Therefore, the thought was, if you could maintain maintain good smells near your nose, you would be protected. The beak had 2 nostrils at the very end of it and was filled with herbs and spices, particularly lavender. The freshly stuffed beak served as a perfect filtration system, or so they thought. The beak is tightly fastened to your face, making sure to prevent any ways for bad air to leak in. Finally, you put on your leather hat and grab your cane, which will be proving very useful very shortly. Now that you're fully equipped, you grab your medical tool bag and you're out the door. You live in an area that's relatively untouched by the plague, at least comparatively speaking, but you work day in and day out in the most devastated parts. Plague doctors were hired by cities to help provide services to low-income citizens who weren't able to pay for proper care, and unfortunately, that typically meant you were dealing with the worst cases possible. These slummish conditions of these poverty-stricken neighborhoods allowed disease to run wild and destroy almost everything in its path. You approach your first house call, checking up on a patient you visited the day before. Before you could even get to this person's door, you are met with a disgruntled and obviously sickly person, desperate for answers and help. This is where one of the use cases of this cane comes in. Tensions were reasonably high, and unfortunately for many people, proper care was simply not an option. People were desperate to get any time or attention they could from the plague doctors, even if that meant assaulting them. It sounds counterintuitive, but people were desperate. You are literally beating people off with a stick to maintain a distance between yourself and people who will likely be dead within the next few days. You enter the residence of your first house call and things are looking grim. Your patient has buboes all over their neck, arms, and legs. These buboes are the inflammation of the lymph nodes, causing large blood and pus-filled boils to appear all over the patient's body. These painful buboes also burst and leave open, oozing wounds. You use your cane again for its second purpose, checking if your patient is even alive. You maintain your distance and nudge them a few times. In this case, your patient wakes up, but only barely. Almost all of the information available is anecdotal, and your tool bag is light and unequipped. For this specific patient, you recommend bloodletting. You open a jar of leeches and start placing the leeches on the buboes to help drain them. As these leeches are applied, you hand this patient a bouquet of flowers to allow them to smell good air. After a roughly 30-minute treatment, you let them know that you don't believe they'll be alive by morning. In this case, you do take a will and last testament from them, something that you'll be able to provide to any of their living family. You pack up your things and you're back onto the street. It's cold, gloomy, and the street is only populated with rats feeding off dead bodies and the smell of death. Although helping people is your only goal, typically even the sight of you was a bad omen. Many people only saw plague doctors days before death, and therefore associated seeing you with dying in the near future. On your walks between house calls, you always ponder on what could be causing such a disease. You know this isn't the first plague, not by a long shot. From the plague of Justinian to the Black Death that eliminated almost a third of Europe, to now, with the resurgence of the plague in Venice, we still have very limited information about what is happening. At this point, the government has tried quarantining the sick and those who even appear to potentially be sick, putting them on a remote island and burning all of their earthly belongings to make sure that there is nothing left to spread the disease. It seems like every day the death count only rises and rises, and those who become infected by the disease live a horrible last few days. The disease starts with the appearance of these buboes, which is typically a mark of death. These buboes multiply in numbers and grow in size, sometimes getting as large as an apple. Hours or potentially even days later, you are met with an extreme fever and a throat-scratching cough. Your body rejects all foods and liquids, and sometimes dehydration would kill you before the plague could. This disease can be so fast-acting that someone can go to bed feeling relatively fine and not wake up in the morning. Before germ theory was ever a thing, miasma theory was the prominent scholarly belief. The theory was simple and refers to the bad air I mentioned earlier. The miasma theory stated that diseases such as the plague were spread through bad air or night air, or essentially noxious gas, meaning that it was the smell that carried the disease and nothing else, which is why the plague doctors kept good smells, perfumes, and spices and herbs in their mask, as the good smells would counteract the bad smells, which unfortunately wasn't extremely effective. It's also for this reason why your thick coat is covered in animal fats and scented wax. You arrive at your next house call, but this patient is no longer with you. But you knew that going into it. You're not treating this person, you're performing an autopsy. On top of treating people, witnessing and writing wills and testaments, plague doctors also performed autopsies when requested to collect information about cause of death and the disease itself. In this case, you're documenting the body of this victim and checking their insides to see what exactly was affected by the plague. This is one of the most dangerous actions for plague doctors, as this presents them with the highest opportunity to get infected bodily fluids on their clothing and on their skin, which could easily infect and kill the doctor. Those who became infected with the plague died within 3 to 8 days, and the death rate of the plague was 80%, meaning that this disease for most people was a death sentence. The deadliness of this disease was actually part of its downfall, as although it was spread through unhygienic, tightly packed urban areas, due to the fact that it killed so quickly, it got to a point where it started running out of victims and started killing itself off as it was unable to find and spread itself to other hosts. Near the end of the plague, people began to understand that transmission occurred when people were in contact with each other. Therefore, quarantining and maintaining distance from others became much more popular. It wasn't known at the time, but the biggest spread of the disease was through infected fleas that lived on rats. Rats that also populated these urban areas heavily. The word quarantine actually comes from the word quarantino, which means 40 days in Italian. This is because when boats would dock at the ports of Italy, they would make these sailors stay on their boat for 40 days to ensure that they were not bringing any disease with them. It's interesting to retrospectively look back at the practices of the time, but unfortunately, when you're in the middle of this situation, tensions were high and information was limited. Some people believed that this plague was a punishment from God, and people took this belief into their own hands and began killing people that they thought to be sinful to help end the plague early by removing the sinful from this world. The psyche of the general population was at an all-time low. When you wake up every day to bodies being carried in front of your house, being brought to burn piles, seeing people covered in awful lumps all over their body, and having a third of your family pass away overnight, you simply can't maintain a normal mind. As a doctor and hired professional, you do your best, but even for you, it's not easy. You finish your day, getting home late, making yourself a meal and resting, as you have another busy day tomorrow, doing all the same things over and over again, hoping that the number of deaths doesn't increase too much, and hoping that you didn't get infected yourself. This same cycle continues over the next years and years until signs of hope start to glimmer, with so many people dying that it's simply harder for the disease to spread. With increased quarantine measures and increased awareness about hygiene in the mind of the population, it appears that the disease is starting to lift and potentially things are starting to look better. You may be out of the job, but you're completely happy about that because your job requires hell and you'd rather be retired in heaven than employed in hell. The government relieves you from your duties and you go back to your home in the countryside, finally reconnecting with your wife and children after years of no contact, because even sending a letter could potentially spread the disease as bad air could be trapped in the envelope. You arrive in the countryside to a wife who's breaking down at the sight of you and kids who barely recognize you. You all share a pleasant moment and then go inside. Your wife prepares you a beautiful meal for your return, and your children just want to know who you are and where their dad has been. You have the best day that you've ever had in your life, and you feel that maybe this endless nightmare is over. You tuck your young children into bed for the first time in years, and before going to bed yourself, you go to the washroom. And by washroom, I mean you step outside to take a leak. You unzip your pants and urinate into the vegetable garden you didn't realize your wife planted there. You give yourself a few shakes and realize something on your leg. It's a small lump on your inner groin. It's unfortunately something you're familiar with. And now, the timer is ticking.